The summer Mara Quinn turned 23, Blackstone Ridge was the kind of town that had already decided what it thought of everyone in it. It was not a malicious place exactly. It was just small. And small places run on certainty the way engines run on fuel. The certainty of who mattered and who didn't, who was worth listening to and who was just noise. Mara had been filed under noise for most of her life. And by the summer the drought first started showing its teeth at the edge of the valley, she'd more or less accepted that as the working arrangement. She was not what the town considered pretty. She was heavy-set, broad-shouldered, with thick dark hair she kept pinned back because it got in the way of things she was actually trying to do. Her dresses were mended in 3 or 4 places. Her boots were good boots. Her father had bought them the year before the bank took the farm, but they were starting to wear at the left heel, and she hadn't had the money to get them resold. She had a face that people described as plain when they were being charitable, and as something else when they weren't. She had brown eyes that were a little too sharp for a woman in her position, people said, like she was always calculating something. She was always calculating something. Her father, Thomas Quinn, had worked the same 40 acres his own father had broken ground on, and he'd worked it honestly, and he'd still lost it. The drought 3 years back had cut the yield in half, and the loan he'd taken to cover the shortfall had terms that tightened like a noose the moment the bank changed hands. By the time Mara understood what was happening, really understood, not just felt the dread of it, but saw the mechanism clearly, it was already finished. The auction notice went up on a Tuesday. Her father died of a fever 6 weeks later, which the doctor listed as the cause, and which Mara knew was not exactly the cause. She had a younger brother, Eli, who was 16 and had gone to work for a freighting company in the next county. She sent him what she could. She kept almost nothing. What she kept mostly was her father's habit of reading. Thomas Quinn had been a man who believed that if you understood something well enough, you could work with it. He'd kept records going back 20 years, rainfall totals, planting dates, water levels in the creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property. He'd made notes in the margins of county bulletins and agricultural pamphlets that Mara had grown up watching him study by lamplight. After he died, she kept all of it. She didn't know yet why. It was just that throwing it away felt like the last thing, and she wasn't ready for the last thing. She survived the first year after the farm by doing whatever work she could get. She took in mending. She cleaned the Halverson house twice a week. She kept books for a feed merchant named Gideon Pratt, who had more money than organizational capacity and who paid her fairly because he was, despite everything else about him, an honest man. She slept in a room above the dry goods store that was barely wide enough for the cot and the small trunk where she kept her father's papers. She was not miserable. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. Miserable was a luxury that required the time to sit in it, and Mara didn't have that time. She was tired, most days, in the specific way that comes from working without rest toward a destination you aren't sure exists. But she was not broken. She kept waiting to feel broken, and it kept not happening, and eventually she stopped waiting and just got on with things. It was the land records that started it. She'd begun going to the county records office originally because of something her father had written in the margins of an old water rights pamphlet. A question, really, not a statement. Why does the creek run lower now than it did when grandfather settled here? Same rainfall years. Something changed upstream. She'd read that note a dozen times over the years and never thought much of it. Then, the summer she was 23, with the heat already building towards something mean, she read it again and something caught. The county records office was kept by a man named Gerald Hess, who was 54 years old, had held the position for 19 years, and had strong opinions about who deserved access to public records and who was wasting his time. He was not, strictly speaking, able to prevent Mara from accessing them. They were public records. That was the whole point. But he had a gift for making the experience as unpleasant as possible for people he'd already categorized. The first time Mara came in and asked for the water rights filings going back to the county's founding, he'd laughed, as described. She'd gotten what she came for anyway, because the law was on her side even if Gerald Hess wasn't, and she'd sat at that dusty table for 4 hours and started reading. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She was looking, initially, for an explanation for her father's question. The creek had run lower in recent decades. The records confirmed it. Water level measurements from earlier surveys were significantly higher than what anyone in the valley was working with now. She'd assumed, going in, that she'd find something mundane. A natural shift in the watershed, a change in upstream land use, something that would explain it and close the question. What she found instead took her 3 weeks to fully understand, and another 2 weeks to convince herself she wasn't wrong about. Rhett Calloway had been running his family's ranch since he was 26, when his father's health failed and there was no one else to do it. He was 38 now, which in Blackstone Ridge meant he was old enough to be taken seriously and young enough that people still expected him to be around for a while. He was not a handsome man in the way that word gets used carelessly. He was weathered and angular, with a jaw that looked like it had been hit a few times and cheekbones that caught the light at odd angles. He had a reputation for being fair and a secondary reputation for being blunt, which in his experience were usually the same quality described by different people. The Calloway Ranch, Broken Creek Ranch, named for the way the creek bent sharply at the southern boundary, was the largest single operation in the valley. Not the wealthiest, there were men in Blackstone Ridge with more cash money than Rhett Calloway. But in terms of land and cattle and the complicated math of a working ranch, Broken Creek was the backbone of what the valley was economically. Rhett understood this and found it more burden than pride, which was, he suspected, why his father had chosen him over his 2 brothers to run it. He knew who Mara Quinn was the way everyone in Blackstone Ridge knew who she was, by her circumstances more than by her. Thomas Quinn's daughter, the one who'd stayed when the farm went, kept herself going on odd jobs. A little odd, people said. Spent a lot of time at the records office, which Gerald Hess found irritating and complained about at enough social occasions that it had become a minor running topic. "What does she think she's going to find in there?" was a common phrasing of the joke. Rhett didn't have a strong opinion about Mara Quinn either way. He had enough to manage without forming opinions about people he'd never spoken to. They met properly at the feed merchant's. Mara was leaving Gideon Pratt's office on a Thursday afternoon in late July, carrying a ledger under one arm and a folder of her own papers under the other, when she misjudged the step down from the boardwalk and went sideways. She caught herself on the post, didn't fall, not quite, but the folder went, and papers scattered across about 6 feet of Main Street with the efficiency that only really important papers can achieve when they escape. Rhett was coming out of the hardware store 2 doors down. He saw it happen, walked over, and started picking up papers without being asked or making a production of it. Mara, already crouching to gather them, looked up and found herself eye level with a pair of worn boots she didn't recognize. "Thank you," she said, reaching for the pages he'd collected. He handed them over. "Wind's picking up," he said, which was both true and about as useful as remarking on gravity, but it was the kind of thing you said. She was already sorting them by feel. She knew the set of papers well enough to organize them without looking, and something about the way she was doing it made him pause. She wasn't flustered. She hadn't done the thing most people did when they'd just embarrassed themselves in public, which was apologize reflexively to everyone in the vicinity. She was just dealing with the situation in front of her with a focused efficiency that was a little unusual. "Mara Quinn?" he said. She looked up again. "Yes." "Rhett Calloway." "I know who you are." She said it without particular effect, just factually. Then, because she was not entirely without social instinct, "Thank you for the help." He nodded, looked at the papers she was consolidating. "Those are survey maps." "Yes. Old ones. Very old." She stood, the folder secured. "County originals from the first territorial surveys. Gideon lets me keep copies here, since the records office doesn't exactly encourage extended research." Rhett looked at her for a moment. "Gerald Hess giving you trouble?" "Nothing I can't manage." A pause. "Your ranch is on the creek's east branch." "It is." "Have you noticed the water level dropping? Not just this year, over the last decade." He had, in fact, noticed exactly that. It was one of the ongoing headaches of running the ranch. The creek that gave the property its name had been running lower every year, and they'd compensated by drilling additional wells. But wells had limits, and this summer was testing them. He'd put it down to drought cycles, the same way everyone did. "I've noticed," he said. "It's not the drought," she said. "I mean, the drought is making it worse right now, but the underlying problem predates the drought by at least 15 years. She stopped herself. "Sorry, I don't usually start in on this with people I've just met." "You didn't just start in," he said. "I asked." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between cautious and assessing. Are you interested in the actual explanation, or are you being polite? I'm not much for being polite when there's something more useful to do. That seemed to land with her. She shifted the folder under her arm. The water rights in this valley have been filed and refiled about 9 times since the original territorial surveys. Most of those refilings were routine. Land changed hands, people updated the documentation. But there are 3 refilings, going back about 22 years, that don't match the underlying survey data. Someone restructured the upstream water rights documentation in a way that, on paper, looks like standard administrative updating. But if you map it against the original surveys, you can see that the effective water access for the lower valley ranches was quietly reduced every time. Not eliminated, just reduced. Enough that no one would notice in a good water year. Rhett was quiet for a moment. And in a bad water year? In a bad water year, Mara said, the people who hold the restructured rights control the access. And whoever controls access, in a drought severe enough, effectively controls the land. Because land without water isn't worth the tax bill. The street noise continued around them. Someone's horse was impatient at the hitching post. A woman called her child's name from across the way. Rhett stood on the boardwalk in the building afternoon heat and turned what Mara had just said over in his mind with the methodical care of a man who had been wrong before and knew what it cost. That's a serious allegation, he said. It's not an allegation yet, she said. It's a pattern in the records. I haven't identified who structured the refilings or who benefits. I'm still working through it. How long have you been working through it? 5 weeks? On your own? Yes. He looked at her for another moment. And you're telling me this why? It was a fair question, and she took it seriously. Because your ranch is the largest operation on the East Branch, which means you're the most exposed if I'm right. And because, she paused, seemed to make a decision, because I've been doing this on my own for 5 weeks, and I'm starting to wonder if I need someone who will actually look at what I've found, instead of just telling me I'm confused about things I'm not confused about. Rhett said nothing for a moment. Then, I've got time Friday morning if you want to bring what you have. Mara looked at him steadily. You're not going to ask if I know what I'm talking about? You just explained the mechanics of a 22-year water rights manipulation to me in about 90 seconds on a street corner, he said. Seems like you know what you're talking about. Boy, she brought everything Friday morning. The Callaway Ranch House was a working building. Solid, not fancy, with the kind of organized disorder that comes from a lot of people doing a lot of different things in the same space. Rhett's foreman, a compact and quiet man named Dale Oakes, was in and out of the kitchen twice while Mara sat up at the table in the front room. He didn't say anything to her directly, but she caught him looking, and she had the distinct impression she was being evaluated. She'd done worse under evaluation. She spread the survey maps first, then the water rights filings in chronological order, then the comparison document she'd made herself. Careful notations that tracked the specific language changes across each refiling. She'd borrowed drafting paper from Gideon Pratt and done the overlays herself, which was not precise work, but was precise enough to show what she needed to show. Rhett sat across from her and looked at everything she'd laid out with the focused attention of a man who did not do things by half. He didn't ask many questions during the first pass, just looked and occasionally moved a document to compare it to another and said nothing. After about 40 minutes, he said, "Walk me through the third refiling." She did. The third refiling was the one that bothered her most, the one where the legal language had been restructured in a way that was almost elegant in its subtlety, embedding a conditional access clause in the definition of primary beneficial use that would have been unremarkable to anyone reading a single filing in isolation, but that, against the background of the 2 previous refilings, represented a decisive shift in who actually controlled the valley's water and shortage conditions. When she finished, Rhett sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Who filed this?" he said. The third refiling was submitted by an attorney named Caldwell Briggs. He's been associated with Harlan Voss's business interests going back about 25 years. Harlan Voss was not a man who needed introduction in Blackstone Ridge. He was 60, silver-haired, and owned the largest mercantile operation in the territory, along with interests in the bank, the grain elevator, and 2 of the valley's smaller ranches that he'd acquired in the last decade from families who'd hit hard years. He sat on the county land board, where he'd served for 12 years, and he was known as a man of substantial civic generosity. He'd funded the new schoolhouse, The repaired bridge on the North Road, several other projects that people spoke of when they spoke of him, which they did fairly often and fairly warmly. Rhett knew Harlan Voss. He'd done business with him. He didn't dislike him exactly, but he'd always had the vague sense, the kind you don't put into words because it doesn't come with evidence, that Voss's generosity had a purpose the way a good investment has a purpose. "You're saying Voss engineered the water rights restructuring," Rhett said. "I'm saying the documentation trail connects to his attorney. I'm saying the pattern of refilings tracks with his land acquisitions. I'm not saying I can prove intent yet." She met his eyes. "I'm being careful. I understand what it means to make this kind of claim about a man like Harlan Voss. Do you understand what it means that you've been sitting alone in the records office for 5 weeks with this? Gerald Hess is deeply unpleasant, but I don't think he's dangerous." "Gerald Hess isn't who I'm thinking about." She looked at him. "I'm not naive, Mr. Calloway. I didn't say you were. I'm saying this is not a situation where careful and alone is sustainable." Mara was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the ranch hands was moving cattle, and the lowing of the herd carried faintly through the window. It was a sound that meant the ranch was functioning, that there was still water and feed to sustain the animals, that the disaster she had spent 5 weeks mapping had not yet arrived. It would, she was fairly certain. The drought was getting worse. She could read the creek levels the way her father had taught her, and what she read was not good. "I can't pay you for your help," she said finally. "I didn't say anything about payment. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be any confusion about what I can and can't offer in exchange for Miss Quinn." He said it quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. "I have 1,700 cattle in this valley and a ranch that has been in my family for 30 years. If what you found is what you think it is, I have a great deal more to lose from doing nothing than from helping you do something about it. That's not charity. That's arithmetic." She absorbed that, nodded once. "All right. What do you need next?" "I need to get into the older county records, the ones from before the first refiling. They should be in the basement archive. Gerald Hess has been telling me they're inaccessible for preservation reasons, but I think he doesn't want me in there." "I'll come with you Monday," Rhett said. "Gerald Hess and I are old enough acquaintances that he'll be less inclined to run the accessibility argument with me standing there." Mara almost said something. Stopped. What she'd been about to say was that she didn't need someone to smooth the way for her, that she'd managed Gerald Hess for 5 weeks on her own, that she was perfectly capable, but she made herself think past the automatic refusal and ask whether it was true in this specific situation. The basement archive. The document she needed. The man standing between her and them who responded to her with contempt and to Rhett with something more like deference. It was not about capability. It was about which tool was right for which job. "Monday morning," she said. "Thank you." The town noticed, of course. In Blackstone Ridge, things were noticed. By the following Tuesday, it had circulated that Mara Quinn had been seen going into the county records with Rhett Calloway and that they'd spent 2 hours in the basement archive together. And by Wednesday, the interpretation of this fact had branched in several directions, almost none of them accurate. The version Clara Weston told at the dress shop was that Mara had maneuvered herself into Rhett's attention by some means and was clearly trying to attach herself to the Calloway name, which was exactly the kind of desperate move you'd expect from a woman in her position. Clara Weston was 31, had a husband who owned the saddle shop and a pointed investment in the social hierarchy of Blackstone Ridge, and had been unkind to Mara since they were children, in a way that had never been openly cruel enough to confront. The version Tom Hadley told at the saloon was slightly more charitable. He figured Mara was probably helping Rhett with something administrative, which was the kind of work she was good for, and Rhett being Rhett probably felt sorry for her. The version Gerald Hess told anyone who would listen was that he didn't appreciate having his professional judgment questioned in his own office, and that Rhett Calloway could have all the access to the basement archive he wanted, but it wasn't going to change the fact that there was nothing down there worth looking for. None of them were paying attention to what Mara had actually found in the basement archive, which was considerable. The older records confirmed the baseline: pre-manipulation water flow data, original survey markers, the earliest water rights assignments from the territorial period. It was all there, dusty and undisturbed, and precisely as useful as she'd hoped. She photographed what she could with Gideon Pratt's camera, which he'd lent her without asking questions because Gideon Pratt had a gift for knowing which questions not to ask. She took meticulous notes on everything else. The picture that emerged was worse than she'd initially thought. The original water rights structure for the valley had been genuinely equitable, designed to ensure that all properties with creek access maintained proportional rights regardless of drought conditions. Whoever had restructured it over the following decades had not simply adjusted the shares. They had redesigned the conditionality so that in shortage conditions, the rights cascaded in a specific sequence that would leave the lower valley ranches, the majority of working operations in Blackstone Ridge, effectively without enforceable water access at the exact moment they needed it most. It was not crude theft. It was considerably more sophisticated than that. Whoever designed this understood water law, Mara told Rhett back at the ranch on Thursday evening. Dale Oaks had joined them. Rhett had brought him in, said he needed someone else who understood what they were dealing with, and Mara had accepted this without objection. Dale Oaks was a man who communicated primarily through listening, and she found this easier to work with than she'd expected. This isn't someone who grabbed at a quick advantage. This is someone who looked 20 years ahead and designed the structure to pay off at the exact worst moment. A drought, Dale said. A drought severe enough to trigger the shortage conditionality, which, she looked at her notes, according to the creek level data, we are currently 3 to 4 weeks from. The room was quiet. Outside, the evening was settling, and the light through the window was the tired amber of a summer that had been burning too long. Rhett's hands were flat on the table, not tense exactly, but still. 4 weeks, he said. Maybe less. The creek is dropping faster than the model projected. She pulled out the level measurements she'd been taking herself, 3 times a week since she'd understood what she was looking at. When it hits this level, she indicated the number, the shortage conditionality in the third refiling activates. At that point, the ranches on the east and south branches have no enforceable water rights. They can be told to cease drawing, and if they refuse, they're in violation. And then what? Dale said. And then they're looking at injunctions, legal costs, cattle dying. Most of them can't sustain a legal fight long enough to win it, even if they're in the right. They sell, at whatever price they can get. She paused. Which will be substantially below value, because the buyers will already know that the water problem is eventually going to be resolved one way or another. They'll be buying distressed properties that they can hold until the situation is corrected. And who'll be buying? Rhett said. Not a question. The land acquisitions over the last 5 years, Mara said. I mapped them. I don't have direct proof yet that they're coordinated, but the pattern, she laid out the map she'd made, properties highlighted in a color she'd indicated with pencil hatching. The properties that have already changed hands are positioned in a specific way relative to the water rights structure. Whoever is buying knows which properties will be most distressed and most valuable once the water problem is resolved. Rhett looked at the map for a long time. You built all of this yourself, he said. Yes. In the past 5 weeks. I work quickly when the material is interesting. Dale made a sound that might have been a laugh, very brief. Rhett looked up from the map. I need to bring in a lawyer, someone from outside the territory. I don't trust anyone locally on something this connected to local interests. That's the right move, Mara said, but it takes time. A few weeks to make contact, arrange a meeting. I know. He looked out the window. We might not have a few weeks before the threshold. No, she said. We might not. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was the kind that comes from thinking hard about something real, and Mara had learned to recognize the difference. She'd spent a lot of her life in the other kind of silence, the dismissive kind, the kind that says, "Why are you still talking?" The kind Gerald Hess had perfected into a form of ambient contempt. This was different. This was 2 people and a third sitting with an actual problem and actually trying to think through it. She had not had much of that in her life. She was surprised to find how much she'd been missing it. Cool. The weeks that followed moved in 2 registers simultaneously. In the one the town could see, nothing much happened. Mara continued her odd jobs. She kept Gideon Pratt's books. She was seen at the records office. She was seen at the Callaway Ranch, which continued to circulate as conversation. Clara Weston refined her theory. Gerald Hess remained aggrieved. In the register no one could see, a considerable amount was happening. Rhett had written to a lawyer named Samuel Guard in the territorial capital, a man he'd met once, years ago, in a boundary dispute, who'd struck him as meticulous and honest. The letter was carefully worded, specific enough to convey the seriousness of what they'd found, vague enough that it didn't put the full picture in writing. Guard wrote back in 10 days. He was interested. He was also careful. He wanted to see the documentation before he'd commit to anything, which was exactly the right posture. Mara had continued building the evidentiary record. She'd found 2 more connections, a business registry filing from 12 years ago that linked Harlan Voss to a land holding company under a different name, and an old correspondence in the county records that shouldn't have been in the county records at all, but was. Because whoever filed it had been careless or confident. The confidence bothered her more than the carelessness would have. Carelessness was random. Confidence was structural. She'd also told 3 other ranch families. She'd been careful about this, had thought hard about who to approach, how much to share, what to ask of them. She wasn't asking them to do anything yet. She was asking them to understand what she was looking at and to tell her if any of it matched what they'd seen in their own experience with the valley's water over the past decade. All 3 had said yes. All 3 had stories that added pieces to the picture she was assembling. The Hendersons, on the South Branch, had been told 3 years ago by a county official that a water rights amendment they'd submitted had been administratively rejected for reasons that the official had been unable to explain clearly. The Tarrant family had a similar story. The Drummond operation, smaller than most but positioned at a key point in the tributary system, had been approached last year by a buyer offering significantly below market. Old Frank Drummond had refused, not because he understood what the offer meant in context, but because he'd been suspicious of the buyer's easy manner. He came in like he already owned it, Frank Drummond told Mara, sitting on his porch in the declining heat of an August evening. He was 71, built like something that had been put together with field materials and had lasted precisely because it wasn't trying to be anything fancy. Made me angry, tell you the truth. I told him I'd burn the place before I'd sell to someone who looked at me like I was already gone. Did he give you a name? Felton something. Said he represented a land company. Gave me a card. Drummond disappeared into the house and came back with a card that had been in his shirt pocket long enough to be soft at the edges. The company name was Meridian Land and Resources. The name on the card was Martin Felton. Mara wrote it down carefully. Do you mind if I keep this? Take it. It's been giving me a bad feeling every time I see it. She looked at the card in her hand. Meridian Land and Resources. She'd find out who owned it. She already suspected, but she'd find out. She walked back toward town as the sun went flat and red on the horizon, her boots raising small puffs of dust from the road. The land around her was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not yet, but the kind of dry that was a direction rather than a state, the kind that had somewhere specific it was heading. The grass had gone from green to yellow to a pale and exhausted brown at the edges. The creek, when she'd checked it that morning, was lower than it had been the previous week. She thought about what Rhett had said. Arithmetic. She was not a woman who had ever been offered rescue in any form she trusted, and she didn't trust this either, not completely. She understood that Rhett Calloway's investment in her work was not about her, but about his ranch and his livelihood, which was entirely rational and the kind of motivation she could actually rely on. She wasn't looking for someone to believe in her. She was looking for someone to work with. That was a different thing, and a better one. The card from Frank Drummond was in her pocket, soft against her fingers. Meridian Land and Resources. She'd find the owner. She'd add it to the record. She'd keep building until the record was unignorable, and then she'd find the right person to put it in front of, and then whatever happened next would happen. That was the plan. It was not elegant, and it did not account for everything that was about to go wrong, but it was honest work, and she was very good at honest work. The town was settling into evening around her as she walked. Lamplights coming on in windows, the smell of cook fires, the sound of someone's child being called in for supper. Blackstone Ridge, doing what it always did, certain of itself and its arrangements, not yet knowing that a woman with a folder of survey maps and 40 years of overlooked records was about 3 weeks from turning every certainty it had upside down. Mara Quinn walked through it and thought about water rights and the creek levels and what she was going to say to Rhett in the morning. She had a great deal of work still to do. Meridian Land and Resources was registered in the territorial capital under a holding company called Crestfield Development, and Crestfield Development was owned by three investors whose names meant nothing to Mara until she cross-referenced the second name against the County Land Board's membership records and found what she'd half expected to find. Warren Voss, Harlan Voss's younger brother. She sat with that for a while at the small table in her room above the dry goods store. The lamp turned up as far as it would go. Her father's old surveying notes spread around the newer documents like a border. Warren Voss was not a name that appeared much in Blackstone Ridge's daily life. He operated out of the capital, kept his business interests at a distance from his brother's more visible local presence, and was known, in the general way that men of money are known, as someone who was good at accumulating more of it. He was not on the land board. He was not on any committee. He had no schoolhouses to his credit. He was the mechanism. Harlan was the face. It was elegant in the way that things are elegant when someone has had a long time to design them carefully. And Mara sat there in the lamp-lit quiet and felt something that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. The specific, cold respect for an adversary who is genuinely good at what they do. It made her careful in a way that anger wouldn't have. Anger was for people who surprised you. This had been running for 20 years. It deserved something more considered than anger. She wrote it all down. She wrote down everything, always, because she had learned from her father that your memory lies to you in ways your own handwriting doesn't, and because the moment this went anywhere official, she needed a record that could stand alone without her there to explain it. In the morning, she walked out to the Callaway Ranch. It was the first week of August, and the heat was different now. Not the honest weight of high summer, but something drier and more insistent, like the air itself was getting impatient. The grass on both sides of the road was brittle. She passed two creeks on the walk that were running so shallow she could have stepped across them without getting the soles of her boots wet. A month ago, she couldn't have done that. Rhett was in the barn when she arrived, working alongside Dale Oakes on something involving a water trough that had cracked along the seam. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face before she said a word. "You found something," he said. "Warren Voss." Dale set down the tool he'd been holding. She told them what she'd traced, the holding company structure, the land acquisitions, the way the Meridian card from Frank Drummond's pocket connected through Crestfield back to the Voss family. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, without dramatics, just the sequence of evidence and what it indicated. When she finished, the barn was quiet except for the sound of horses shifting in their stalls. "Harlan knows about all of this," Rhett said. "Not a question. He'd have to. The water rights restructuring, the legal work. That's not something Warren Voss engineered from the Capitol without someone managing it on the ground here. Caldwell Briggs is Harlan's attorney. The County Land Board, where Harlan sits, approved each of the refilings." She paused. "I think Harlan is the local infrastructure. Warren is the capital and the acquisition end. They've split the visible and the invisible. And between the two of them," Dale said, "they've got everything set up to take this valley apart in the next drought severe enough to trigger the conditionality." "Which we're 3 weeks from," Mara said. "Maybe 2, given the creek levels this morning." Rhett put both hands on the edge of the trough and looked at them for a moment. It was a gesture she was starting to recognize in him. Not hesitation exactly, but a deliberate pause before he spoke, like he was making sure what came out was what he meant to say. Samuel Guard wrote back again. "He's coming in 2 weeks. 2 weeks might be enough, if we can get everything to him in a form he can work with quickly." "I've been thinking about that," Rhett said, "and I think we need to do something before Guard gets here, something that doesn't wait." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "I want to call a meeting. The ranch families on the east and south branches. Not just the 3 you've talked to already. All of them. I want to put what you've found in front of all of them at once." Mara was quiet for a moment. She'd been building this carefully, adding people one at a time, controlling what was shared and when. A meeting was different. A meeting was a door that, once opened, couldn't be closed again. "That's a significant step," she said. "I know. Once people know, some of them will talk. Word will get to Voss. Probably. That changes our timeline. If Voss knows we're onto the structure before the conditionality activates, he may move earlier than planned, use different pressure." Rhett nodded. "I've thought about that. But the alternative is that we get to the conditionality threshold with ranch families who don't know what's coming, who aren't prepared, who get hit with injunctions and legal pressure without any understanding of the situation. I'd rather they know, even if it costs us the element of surprise. He looked at her. You disagree. I think the risk is real, she said carefully. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying we need to be further along in the documentation before the meeting happens. Guard needs to already be in contact, not just coming, but already engaged. And we need to agree on what gets said and what stays in the room. That's fair. He looked at Dale. Can you get word to the Hendersons and the Tarrants today? I'll send someone to the Drummonds and the Kearney Ranch. I want to know who'll come. Dale pulled his hat on. I'll ride out this morning. He left without further comment, which was his way. The barn was quieter with just the two of them. There's something else, Mara said. Rhett waited. I went back through the creek-level data last night, the readings from the last 10 years. I wanted to see if there was any point where the drop became irregular, not just gradually lower, but specifically lower. She pulled out the chart she'd made. There is. About 6 years ago, the rate of decline in the East Branch increased, significantly. She pointed to the numbers. That's not drought, that's not natural variation. That's a reduction in upstream flow that doesn't match any precipitation pattern I can find. Rhett looked at the chart. You're saying someone restricted the upstream flow 6 years ago. I'm saying something happened to it. I don't know how yet. She looked at him. I need to go up into the mountain terrain above the East Branch. The original surveys show an additional water channel that predates the current creek system, an older course. It's marked as dormant, which historically means it was blocked or diverted at some point. I want to see where it is and what condition it's in. That's several days of hard riding in terrain that's not easy. Yes. Not something you should do alone. I'm aware of that. I'm not planning to. She folded the chart. I'm planning to ask if you or Dale can come. Rhett was quiet for a moment. I'll come. Give me until Thursday to get the ranch organized to run a few days without me. Dale can stay and manage things here and manage the meeting prep. Thursday works. He looked at her. Have you done much mountain terrain riding? Enough, she said, which was not entirely accurate. She had done some years ago on horses she no longer had, but she would manage. She had managed larger gaps between what she knew how to do and what needed doing. Rhett seemed to take it at face value, which she appreciated. The meeting happened before Thursday. It happened Tuesday evening in the Callaway Ranch's main barn, with 12 families represented and a lot of people who came in skeptical and left unsettled. Mara had not planned to be the one to speak. She'd prepared everything, organized the documents, built the presentation that walked through the evidence in the clearest sequence she could construct. She'd intended for Rhett to deliver most of it, because Rhett was who these people trusted, and she knew her own position in the room. She was Thomas Quinn's daughter with no land, no husband, no standing that any of the people in that barn were obligated to take seriously. But Rhett had said, before anyone came in, you built this, you should be the one to explain it. They won't. They might not. But they should hear it from you. So she stood in front of 12 ranch families in the August heat with the documents arranged on a makeshift table, and she explained what she'd found. She did not soften it. She did not apologize for the complexity of the water rights law or the number of documents involved. She laid it out as she'd laid it out for Rhett the first time, in sequence clearly, with the evidence visible to anyone who wanted to look. The room was not generous. A man named Carl Briggs, no relation to the attorney, he told people that so often it had become a kind of introduction, was the first to speak. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a ranch on the South Branch and a default expression of skepticism that Mara suspected he'd had since childhood. This is all based on your reading of old county records, he said. Yes, Mara said, records that nobody else has checked. Rhett has reviewed them. Dale Oaks has reviewed them. I'll make copies available to anyone who wants to examine them independently. What I'm asking, Carl Briggs said, with the particular patience of a man who thinks he's explaining something to someone slow, is what makes you qualified to read water rights law? The room was quiet. Mara looked at him. My father kept detailed records of this valley's water for 20 years. I grew up reading survey maps and water rights documentation as part of how we managed our property. I've spent the last 5 weeks in the county records going through every relevant filing with the original survey maps as reference. She kept her voice even. If someone with a law degree wants to review what I found and tell me I'm wrong, I'll listen carefully. Until then, the documents are what they are. And you're saying Harlan Voss is behind this, said a woman near the back, Agnes Kearney, whose family ran one of the larger South Branch operations. Her tone was not hostile, but it was careful in the way people are careful with things that could fall badly. I'm saying the evidence connects to his attorney and to his brother's land acquisition company. I'm not in a position to state intent from documents alone. That's what the lawyer Rhett has contacted will help determine. Harlan Voss has done a lot for this community, Agnes said. Yes, Mara said. He has. The silence that followed that had its own shape. Agnes Kearney looked at her for a long moment. You're not backing down from it. I'm telling you what the records show. What you do with that is your decision. It went on for 2 more hours. There were people who were angry at the situation, at Voss, at Mara, for bringing it to them, sometimes all 3 at once without distinguishing clearly between them. There were people who were frightened, which came out as further hostility because that's often how fear presents in rooms full of people trying to look capable. There were 2 families who left early, said they didn't want any part of this, and Mara marked their names mentally and understood that the information they'd heard was now in motion somewhere she couldn't track. But there were also the Hendersons, who'd come in with their own stories about the administrative rejection of their water rights amendment 3 years ago, and who connected that story to Mara's framework with a quiet fury that settled through the room like a weight. And there was Frank Drummond, who told his story about the man from Meridian Land and Resources again, and who pulled out the business card and held it up, and who said, I've been holding on to this thing for a year not knowing why it bothered me. Now I know. When the last families had gone, Mara sat on the edge of the table in the emptied barn and tried to assess what had happened. Rhett stood nearby, hands in his pockets. That went about as well as it could have, he said. The 2 families who left early, she said. I know. One of them is Calvin Marsh. His brother-in-law works at Harlan Voss's Mercantile. I know that too. So we've lost the element of surprise. Rhett nodded slowly. Probably by tomorrow morning. He looked at her. Does that change the mountain survey? No, she said. If anything, it makes it more urgent. If there's something up there to find, we need to find it before Voss has time to do anything about it. She looked at her hands. I'm tired. You should be. I don't mean, I'm not complaining. She stopped, looked at the barn door, the dark outside it. I've been in rooms like this my whole life. Rooms where the first question is whether I know what I'm talking about. Rhett said nothing for a moment. Then, the Henderson woman, Ruth Henderson, she came up to me after, when you were talking to Frank Drummond. You know what she said? Mara looked at him. She said, that woman is the only person who's told me the truth about my own water rights in 30 years of owning this land. He said it without inflation, just as information. Thought you should know. Mara looked at the empty barn, at the makeshift table with its arranged documents, at the space where 12 families had stood, and some of them had listened, and some of them hadn't, and all of them had heard. Okay, she said. Thursday. We ride Thursday. They left before dawn and rode into the mountain terrain above the East Branch with a pack horse, enough supplies for 4 days, and Mara's copied survey maps in a waterproof case that Rhett had dug out of the ranch storage without comment. The maps were old enough that some of the terrain features had changed. Erosion, rockfall, the natural rewriting that mountains do to themselves over decades. But the primary landmarks held, and Mara was good at translating between what a surveyor from 40 years ago had marked and what was actually in front of her. The terrain was harder than she'd let on when Rhett asked. Not impossible, but the kind of hard that accumulated over hours. Loose rock, steep angles, the particular misery of switchbacks and heat that didn't ease just because you were gaining altitude. Her left heel, where the boot was wearing, rubbed consistently against the stirrup leather in a way that was going to be a real problem by day 2. She didn't mention it. Rhett rode without a lot of conversation, which she'd come to understand was not unfriendliness but focus. He knew the upper terrain better than she did, had ridden it years ago looking for stray cattle, and he navigated with the confidence of someone working from memory rather than from a map, which was useful because there were sections where the map and the actual hillside disagreed. The original channel, she said, on the second afternoon when they'd made camp on a shelf of rock overlooking the valley below. The view was extraordinary, and neither of them remarked on it because there were more pressing things. According to the survey, it should branch off the east branch about 2 miles above where the main creek bends. There's a notation here. She tilted the map toward the light, that the original surveyor marked it as obstructed by deliberate placement, which is unusual language for a dormant natural channel. Rhett looked up from the fire he was building. Someone blocked it on purpose. That's what deliberate placement means, yes. When was this survey made? Territorial period, before the valley was significantly settled. She looked at the notation again. But someone had already blocked it by then, which means it was done very early, before anyone was paying attention to what the water structure looked like, or before anyone who'd noticed was here. Yes. She folded the map carefully. If the channel was flowing, it would add significant volume to the east branch, enough to change the shortage calculation substantially, enough to make the conditionality threshold harder to trigger, enough that triggering it might not even be legally defensible. There's a proportionality requirement in the original territorial water law. If the natural flow is adequate to sustain all users, you can't invoke shortage conditionality. It's a protection against manufactured shortages. She looked at him. If there's a deliberate blockage reducing the natural flow enough to push the system into apparent shortage, that's not just fraud in the water rights restructuring. That's active interference with the territorial water system. Rhett sat back. The fire caught properly and threw light across the rock face behind them. That's a different level of crime. Considerably. And if we can document it, then the shortage conditionality doesn't just get challenged in court, it gets voided, along with every legal action that was ever taken under it. She looked at him. Everything Voss built on that structure falls apart. They were quiet for a while. Somewhere down the slope, something moved in the brush. An animal, nothing significant. The stars were clear overhead in the way they're clear only when you're far enough from town to escape the lamplight. My father asked about the water once, Rhett said. Not connected to anything immediately, just something that came up. Long time ago, when I was maybe 16, he'd been running the ranch for 30 years at that point, and he said the creek wasn't what it used to be. Said it ran stronger when he was young. He looked at the fire. He put it down to dry cycles. I believed him because he was the one who knew things. He was right that it changed, Mara said. He just didn't know why. No. A pause. You know what bothers me most? Not that they built the scheme. People build schemes. What bothers me is that they watched my father run that ranch for 30 years and they knew. They knew what they were setting up for his land and his cattle, and they looked him in the eye at every county meeting and every social occasion, and they just kept watching. Mara didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Sometimes the truth of a thing had to sit without being handled. After a while, Rhett said, "We should sleep. Long day tomorrow." She agreed, and they turned in, and she lay awake for a little while, listening to the mountain and thinking about water and time and the extraordinary patience of people who planned for 20 years. They found the blockage the next morning. It was not subtle. That was the first thing. She'd expected something more concealed, more carefully hidden. But when they came around the upper bend and she cross-referenced the map to the terrain, the obstruction was visible as a deliberate structure. It had been built to look like a natural rockfall from a distance, and it would have looked like one to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for a blocked channel. But up close, at the base of it, you could see the arrangement of the larger stones, the placement that was too consistent to be accidental, the way the smaller material had been packed behind the primary stones to create a seal. "That's not a rockfall," Rhett said. "No." Mara was already pulling out her documentation kit, the camera from Gideon Pratt, the notebook, the surveying measurements she'd taught herself well enough to take with reasonable accuracy. This was built. Someone came up here and built this. She photographed it from 3 angles, made notes on the dimensions, the estimated age of the construction, the comparison between the channel dimensions visible above and below the blockage. Above the blockage, the channel was dry, a shallow carved depression in the rock that clearly hadn't carried water in a long time. Below it, spring moisture still seeped in small amounts through the rock face, which confirmed what the map had indicated. There was still a water source above. It was just being held back. If this were removed, she said, measuring the primary obstruction. What kind of flow would we see? Depends how much water's backed up above. Rhett was looking at the rock face above them, reading terrain the way ranchers read it, for what it meant about water and animal movement. But this channel fed the East Branch in the original survey period, and the East Branch was running strong when my father was young. If the source hasn't changed, we'd see significant volume. Enough to pull the East Branch back above the shortage threshold. Could be. Mara photographed the structure one more time and then stood back and looked at it. A pile of rocks, built probably before most of the people in Blackstone Ridge had been born. Built by someone who was thinking ahead, in the same way that the water rights restructuring was thinking ahead. The same patience, the same willingness to work slowly and wait. I need to get these photographs and measurements to Samuel Guard, she said. He needs to see this before he comes. I'll write him tonight. She looked at the blockage again, at the dry channel above, at the faint moisture seeping below. It can be removed, she said, with the right crew and equipment. It's not a small job, but it's not impossible. Rhett looked at her. You're already thinking about that. I'm thinking about all of it. The legal challenge, the documentation, and what happens if the legal process moves slower than the drought. She looked at him. If the conditionality threshold activates before Guard can file an injunction, people lose their water access. Cattle start dying. The pressure on ranch families to sell becomes very real, very fast. And removing the blockage changes the flow enough that the threshold may not activate. Or if it does, the restored flow creates a factual record that the shortage was artificially maintained. She paused. I don't know which path is right yet. That depends on Guard and how fast he can move. Rhett nodded slowly. Then we get Guard here as fast as possible and we make sure he has everything he needs when he arrives. He looked at the obstruction one more time. And we keep this quiet. Who knows we came up here? Dale. And I told the Hendersons where we were going, in case we didn't come back on schedule. Ruth Henderson won't talk. He seemed certain of that. All right, we head back tomorrow. I want to write to Guard tonight. They made camp at the blockage site, which was not comfortable but gave Mara more time to document and measure while the light lasted. She worked until she couldn't see clearly, and then she sat against the rock and went over her notes by feel, the way she'd gone over her father's papers in the dark above the dry goods store. And she felt the shape of what they had. It was enough. Not for everything. Not for every conclusion she'd drawn. Not for every piece of the structure she'd mapped. But enough for a lawyer like Samuel Guard to take it somewhere real. Enough to make the next conversation harder to laugh off than the last ones had been. She thought about Carl Briggs and his particular patience, explaining things to her. She thought about Gerald Hess and his coffee and his contempt. She thought about the two families who'd left the meeting early and where that information was by now and what Harlan Voss was doing with it. She thought about her father and his notes in the margins. Why does the creek run lower now? It ran lower, Dad, she thought. She didn't say it out loud. But it ran lower because someone built a wall in the dark and waited for a drought and trusted that nobody would ever look closely enough to find out why. They looked. Down in the valley below, invisible from this altitude, the creek was dropping toward a number she'd written down in her notebook, a number that had a deadline attached to it. She'd been watching it for weeks, measuring it 3 times a week, writing it down, watching the gap close between where it was and where it needed to be. 2 weeks, maybe less. The work was not done. The work, in fact, was entering the part that would be harder than anything she'd done in the records office, because the records office was just paper, and what came next involved people. Voss and his brother and Caldwell Briggs, and the county officials who'd approved those refilings. And they were not going to sit still for what was coming. But she had the photographs. She had the measurements. She had Rhett's letter to Samuel Guard, which he was writing right now by firelight, with the particular focused attention she'd come to recognize as his best mode. And she had the records. 40 years of records built by a man who believed that if you understood something well enough, you could work with it, passed down to a daughter who had sat with them long enough to understand what they were saying. Mara Quinn leaned back against the mountain rock and listened to the night and thought about what came next. There was a great deal of it. Samuel Guard arrived on a Wednesday, 2 days earlier than expected, which told Mara something about what he'd made of Rhett's letter. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had settled into a permanent expression of careful attention. Not unfriendly, but the face of someone who spent most of his professional life listening for the thing people weren't saying. He wore a good suit that had traveled badly, and he carried a leather satchel that he kept close the way lawyers kept things they considered important. He came into the Calloway ranch house, shook Rhett's hand, nodded to Dale Oakes, and then turned to Mara with the specific look of a man who has been told something by correspondence and is now calibrating it against what is actually in front of him. "You're the one who found the water rights structure," he said. "Yes." "Walk me through it." So she did. For the better part of 3 hours, with everything laid out on the table, the survey maps, the chronological filings, the comparison documents she'd made herself, the photographs from the mountain blockage, the creek-level data going back a decade. She walked Samuel Guard through everything she'd built. He stopped her regularly with questions that were precise and sometimes uncomfortable, the kind of questions that probed for the gaps in reasoning rather than the strengths. She appreciated that. She'd been the only one probing her own work for weeks, and having someone else do it rigorously was useful in the way that pain is sometimes useful. It told you where things were actually wrong. He found 2 places where her evidentiary chain relied on inference rather than documentation. She knew about both of them already. One she thought could be closed with a records request she hadn't been able to get through Gerald Hess. The other was more structural, a gap she'd identified and hadn't been able to bridge. "The second one is a problem," Guard said. "I know. Without direct documentation connecting the water rights refiling decisions to the Voss family's acquisition strategy, a defendant's lawyer argues the restructuring was routine administrative updating and the land acquisitions are coincidental. It's circumstantial. It's a very strong circumstantial pattern. Patterns don't win cases. Documents do." He looked at the photographs from the mountain survey. "This, however," he tapped the photograph of the blockage. "This is not circumstantial. This is physical evidence of deliberate interference with a territorial water system. If I can get a territorial surveyor to certify the construction is not natural and date it to the relevant period, this becomes the cornerstone." He looked up. "Who else knows about this?" "Dale Oakes. Ruth Henderson. Anyone connected to Voss?" "Not that I know of." Guard looked at Rhett. "I need to file for an emergency injunction against the conditionality activation before the creek hits the threshold. To do that, I need the mountain blockage certified, and I need a territorial water law specialist to co-sign the filing." He checked his watch, a habitual gesture that seemed to orient him. "I have a surveyor I trust. He can be here in 5 days." 5 days, Mara said. The creek level from that morning was in her notebook. She did the arithmetic without looking at it. "We have maybe 8 days before the threshold, 10 if the upstream measurements hold. Then 5 days for the surveyor, 2 days to prep the filing, 1 day of margin." Guard closed his satchel. "It works if nothing goes wrong." Nobody said the obvious thing about the reliability of nothing going wrong. Something went wrong on Thursday. Mara was at Gideon Pratt's office in the early afternoon, working through the month's ledgers, when Gideon came in from the street with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. A careful blankness that meant he'd heard something and was deciding what to do with it. "There's a notice posted at the county courthouse," he said. "Went up this morning." She set down her pen. "What kind of notice?" "Harlan Voss has filed an administrative complaint with the county land board against the county records office." He paused. "Specifically alleging unauthorized access to restricted archival materials and improper removal of original documents." The room was very quiet for a moment. "The basement archive," she said. "The complaint names you." Gideon looked at her steadily, without judgment. "And Rhett Calloway." She absorbed that. The documents she'd accessed in the basement archive were public records. She'd confirmed that multiple times before she'd ever asked Rhett to come with her, had checked the territorial records access statutes herself. But an administrative complaint didn't need to be legally sound to be effective. It needed to be filed, and once filed, it created a procedural cloud over everything she'd taken from that archive. A cloud that a skilled attorney could use to challenge the admissibility of the evidence, to question her methodology, to suggest to a territorial judge that the investigation was itself legally compromised. It was elegant. She had to give Harlan Voss that. "The original documents are still in the archive," she said. "I took copies. I have Gideon's camera records showing their copies. I never removed anything original." "I know," Gideon said it quietly. "I'm just Telling you. Does Rhett know? Probably by now. Word travels. She was already pulling on her jacket. Thank you, Gideon. Mara. He said it before she reached the door, and something in his tone made her stop. He was a large man, heavy-set, with the particular physical stillness of someone who had spent decades behind a counter watching things happen. Be careful. Not about the complaint. You know your rights better than most lawyers I've dealt with. I mean, just be careful generally. He held her eyes for a moment. Men who build things for 20 years don't stop building when they feel threatened. They just build faster. Mom? Rhett had already sent word to Samuel Guard by the time she got to the ranch. The three of them sat in the front room and went through the implications in the efficient, unsentimental way that people go through implications when they don't have the luxury of processing feelings about them first. The complaint is frivolous, Guard said. You accessed public records appropriately. I can have it dismissed, but not instantly. These things move on their own schedule. In the meantime, it creates a discoverable legal action that a defendant's counsel can use to argue your investigation was conducted improperly. Can they suppress the evidence from the archive? Mara asked. They can try. A good judge won't grant it, but the filing creates delay, and that's the point. He looked at his hands. They know we've been in the mountain terrain. Someone told them. Or they tracked where Rhett and I went from the ranch, Mara said. It wouldn't be hard to figure out if someone was watching the property. Were you followed up there? Rhett said, Not that I saw, but I wasn't looking for it. The three of them sat with that for a moment. It changes the urgency on the surveyor, Guard said. I need him here in 3 days, not 5. And I need the mountain site documented before anyone has an opportunity to interfere with it. You think they'd interfere with it, Mara said. Guard looked at her. They built it in the dark 60 years ago, and nobody found it for 60 years. Yes. I think if they believe we found it, they'll consider whether it can be made to look more natural than it currently does, or whether access to the site can be legally complicated before we get a certified surveyor up there. The room was quiet. Outside, the heat pressed against the windows with a mid-afternoon wait. The summer had stopped pretending to be manageable. I'll ride back up tomorrow, Rhett said. With 2 ranch hands, I trust. We make sure the site is preserved, and I'll stay until the surveyor arrives. I'll go too, Mara said. Rhett looked at her. Your boot heel. She'd mentioned it, briefly, on the way down from the mountain. She hadn't intended to. It's fine. It was rubbing on the second day going up, 4 more days on that terrain. It'll be fine, she said, in the tone that ended discussions. I need to be there when the surveyor arrives. I built the documentation from the survey maps, and I know the site. If there are questions about what we found and what it means, I need to be there to answer them. Rhett looked at her for a moment, then at Guard, then back at her. All right. I'll need the surveyor's questions in advance if possible, she told Guard, so I can prepare. I'll write him tonight. But before they could leave in the morning, the county sent someone. He arrived at the Calloway Ranch at 7 in the morning, before the heat had fully committed to the day, while Mara and Rhett were packing the supply horses in the yard. He was a young man with a county deputy's badge and an envelope he seemed unhappy to be carrying, the particular unhappiness of someone who has been given an assignment that he suspects is being used for purposes he wasn't told about. Miss Quinn, he said. Mara took the envelope. Inside was a formal notice from the county magistrate. She was required to appear before the land board the following Monday to respond to the administrative complaint filed by Harlan Voss. Attendance was not optional. Failure to appear would be treated as an acknowledgement of the complaint's validity. Monday was 5 days away. The surveyor Guard was calling for would arrive Thursday at the earliest. The creek threshold could activate as early as Tuesday. The deputy left without saying anything else. Mara stood in the ranch yard with the notice in her hand and looked at the stack of supply packs waiting to be loaded on the horses. They know Monday is too soon, Rhett said from behind her. Yes. They're trying to pull you back here before the surveyor gets to the site. Yes. She folded the notice carefully. It's well done. If I don't appear, I confirm the complaint. If I do appear, I'm not on the mountain with Guard's surveyor. She looked at Rhett. Can you handle the mountain site without me? She could see him working through it. He knew the site. He'd been there, but he didn't have her detailed documentation or her familiarity with the survey map comparisons that would explain to a surveyor exactly what he was looking at and why it mattered. Not as well as with you, he said honestly. Then I need to do both. She looked at the notice again. You write up today. Take Dale's best hand, Cutter knows mountain terrain. Get to the site and stay there. When guard surveyor arrives Thursday, you're there to receive him, and I'll write up Friday, after I've dealt with the land board appearance. The land board appearance is Monday. Preparation for it isn't. She put the notice in her jacket pocket. I need to go see Samuel Guard. Guard's first response to the land board notice was a single, quiet profanity, which Mara found more reassuring than a polished reaction would have been. It told her he was taking it seriously. His second response was to spend 2 hours preparing a written response that would accompany Mara's Monday appearance, a legal brief establishing the public records access rights under territorial law, preemptively challenging the complaint's factual basis, and formally requesting that the land board recuse Harlan Voss from any proceedings given his direct conflict of interest as a board member and a named party in the underlying investigation. They won't grant the recusal, he said, handing her the draft to review. But requesting it puts it in the record, and it signals to every person in that room that we know exactly what this is. Mara read through this brief carefully. It was good work, precise and without excess, the kind of legal writing that moves through arguments efficiently and doesn't leave room for misreading. The part about the Territorial Records Access Statute, she said, pointing to the third page. The citation is right, but the specific subsection you want is 14C, not 14B. 14B covers commercial interests. 14C covers individual property rights holders, which is what I qualify as a landholder's heir. Guard looked at the citation, looked at her, changed it without comment. She appreciated that about him. He didn't make a thing of being corrected. He just fixed it. There's something else, she said, when they'd finished with the brief. I need you to file the injunction application before Monday, before the land board appearance. If it's already filed when I walk in there, the complaint becomes a secondary instrument. They can't use the land board process to effectively block the injunction because the injunction is already in motion. Guard leaned back in his chair. Filing the injunction without the surveyor's certification is weaker. A judge can deny it for insufficient physical evidence. I know. But a denied injunction still establishes the filing date, and if we get the certification Thursday and refile, we're on record as having acted in advance of the shortage threshold, which matters for the liability question later. She held his eyes. If the threshold activates before we file, Voss's attorneys will argue the shortage was naturally occurring and our intervention came after the fact. He was quiet for a long moment. That's correct. So we need to be on record before the threshold, even if the first filing is denied. You understand that a denied injunction also gives the other side something to point to. I understand. I think it's still the right move. She paused. But it's your filing. I'm not a lawyer. You decide. Guard looked at her for a moment. The same calibrating look he'd given her when he arrived. The one that was reading what was actually in front of him rather than what he'd been told to expect. Where did you learn to think about legal strategy? My father kept every piece of paperwork the bank ever sent him, she said. When we lost the farm, I read all of it. I spent about 3 months understanding what had happened to us legally. She looked at the brief on the table. Understanding it didn't change the outcome, but I learned what the instruments looked like. He was quiet for a moment. I'll file tomorrow morning. On Friday morning, Mara rode back up into the mountain terrain with her boot re-heeled. She'd gone to the cobbler the previous evening and stood there while he did it on the spot, paying from what she had, which left her with considerably less than nothing in the way of discretionary funds. She did not think about this during the ride. She thought about the land board appearance and the injunction filing and the creek levels, which she'd checked before leaving and which were lower than they'd been 2 days prior. The surveyor, a man named Edwin Pruitt, had arrived Thursday as Guard promised. He was older than she'd expected. Somewhere in his late 60s, with hands that shook slightly and eyes that absolutely didn't. He'd been doing territorial surveys for 40 years, and he had opinions about what constituted natural geological formation and what didn't, and he held them with the confidence of someone whose professional reputation was built on exactly that distinction. When Mara reached the site Friday afternoon, Pruitt was on his hands and knees examining the base of the blockage with a focused attention that reminded her, unexpectedly, of herself in the county records basement. Rhett was sitting on a rock nearby, watching. Cutter, the ranch hand, was on the slope above keeping watch, at Rhett's instruction, because Rhett had spent the last 2 days in the kind of heightened alertness that comes from being in an exposed position with something worth protecting. Pruitt looked up when Mara arrived, took in her travel-worn condition without remark, and said, "You made the initial survey documentation?" "Yes. Good measurements. Better than I expected for someone without formal training." He returned to the base of the blockage. "This is construction, approximately 60 to 70 years old, based on the weathering and lichen growth patterns. The primary stones were placed. They were not deposited by water or gravity. The mortar compound in the gaps is consistent with the type used in the territorial period." He sat back on his heels. "This was built by someone who knew what they were doing, and who specifically intended to block this channel permanently." "Can you certify that?" Mara asked. "Yes." He looked up at her. "I'll also certify that based on the channel dimensions and the source spring indicators above, restoring flow through this channel would produce a significant volume increase to the downstream system." He paused. "Significant enough to alter shortage calculations materially." Mara looked at Rhett. Something moved through the look between them that didn't require words. "How long for the certification document?" she asked Pruitt. "I need 2 more hours here and then I'll write it overnight. You'll have it tomorrow morning." "I need to be back in town for a land board appearance Monday morning." Pruitt looked at her. "Then you'll have it Sunday." "Well." The land board met in the county courthouse building, in a room that smelled of old paper and was lit by windows that gave onto the main street. Mara arrived early, which was deliberate. She wanted to be seated and settled before anyone else came in, to occupy the room on her own terms rather than enter it already reactive. Guard was with her. He dressed with the precise care of someone who understood that appearance in formal proceedings was a tool like any other. There were 5 board members. Harlan Voss sat at the far end of the table, which put him in her sightline for the entire proceeding. He was exactly as she'd always seen him, silver-haired, measured, with a face that gave nothing away that he didn't intend to give. He looked at her when she entered with the same steady regard he would have given anyone, which was itself a kind of message. She was not rattled enough to be treated differently. Guard had submitted the recusal request. It was denied before the session opened, as he'd predicted. The board chair, a man named Foster, who had the harried look of someone who'd been briefed on this morning's proceeding and wasn't happy about any of it, read out the complaint in a tone of careful neutrality. Guard presented the written response first. He did it efficiently, cited the territorial statutes, established the public records access rights, addressed each factual claim in the complaint with the corresponding documentation. The board members who were paying attention, 2 of the 5 by Mara's assessment, followed it closely. The other 3 were in various states of apparent discomfort that told her the politics of this morning had already been discussed somewhere she hadn't been. Then Harlan Voss's attorney, a man named Dexter Roan, who had come in from outside the territory, spoke. He was polished in the way of lawyers who work primarily for wealthy clients. Never loud, never ruffled, relentlessly focused on framing. He did not attack Mara directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he questioned the methodology, the completeness of the record, the qualifications of someone without formal training to interpret legal documents, and the appropriateness of what he called a private investigation conducted without transparency or legal oversight. Mara listened to all of it and took notes on a small pad she'd brought. When Rowan finished, Foster looked down the table and said, with the air of a man performing a formality, "Miss Quinn, you may respond." She stood up. She'd prepared what she was going to say, and then the night before, thrown most of it away. Prepared statements had a quality that worked against her in rooms like this. They sounded like she was defending herself, and she wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to establish a record. "The documents I accessed were public records," she said. "I accessed them under the rights established in Territorial Statute 14C, which Mr. Guard has cited in the written response you have. I removed copies, not originals. The camera records documenting the copying process are available for inspection." She looked at the board, not at Roan, not at Voss, at the board members. This complaint was filed 8 days after I presented evidence of a 20-year water rights manipulation to a group of Valley Ranch families, and 4 days after a territorial attorney engaged with that evidence. The timing of this complaint is part of the record. Foster shifted in his chair. I'm not here to argue about the complaint, she continued. The complaint's legal basis is addressed in the written response. I'm here to inform this board that a territorial injunction has been filed in relation to the water rights conditionality structure that is currently approaching activation threshold. That filing includes physical evidence of deliberate obstruction of a territorial water channel, certified by a surveyor with 40 years of territorial experience. She set Pruitt's certification document on the table in front of Foster. You'll find a copy there. The room was very quiet. She looked at Harlan Voss. She did it deliberately and held it for a moment, not as a challenge, just as acknowledgement. I see you and I know what you built, and it is now in front of people who have the authority to take it apart. Then she looked away. That's what I have, she said, and sat down. Guard beside her said nothing. He didn't need to. Rowan asked for a continuance of the complaint proceedings. Foster granted it, which was neither a victory nor a defeat. It meant the complaint remained technically open, which Rowan wanted, but it also meant the board wasn't moving on it today, which Guard could work with. The session ended with a quality of unfinished tension that reminded Mara of the way certain storms felt in the afternoon. Not broken yet, but working up to it. In the corridor outside, Rowan caught up with them before they reached the door. Mr. Guard, he said. He didn't acknowledge Mara, which was a choice she noted without responding to. Guard stopped. Mr. Rowan, my client is open to a discussion about the water rights question. Rowan's voice was smooth, genuinely pleasant in its delivery. There may be room for an administrative resolution that addresses the concerns your side has raised without the cost and disruption of protracted litigation. I appreciate that, Guard said. Put it in writing and I'll review it. Of course. I'd suggest sooner rather than later, given the timeline pressures involved. We're aware of the timeline. Rowan nodded and left. They watched him go. He's trying to buy time, Mara said when he was out of earshot. Or they've assessed the injunction filing, and they're worried. Guard looked at her. Pruitt's certification was the piece they weren't counting on. Do we engage with any offer they make? We review it. Whatever they propose will be designed to resolve this in a way that leaves the underlying structure intact and gets you and Rhett to agree to silence. He looked at her. You understand that? Yes. And we don't agree to that. She said it simply, without drama. The families in this valley have been operating on false information about their water rights for 20 years. Any resolution that doesn't correct that isn't a resolution. Guard nodded slowly. The injunction hearing is Wednesday. If the judge grants it, the conditionality can't activate until the case is heard on its merits. Wednesday was 2 days away. The creek threshold, by her last measurement, was perhaps 4 days away. The margin was thin enough that she could feel it. Back at the ranch that evening, the drought announced itself in a way that was no longer deniable. One of Rhett's hands came in from the south pasture at sundown to report that 2 cattle had gone down. Not dead, but distressed, weakened by the combination of heat and the declining water access from the south branch. The creek in the south pasture had dropped to a level where cattle were having to wade into the center to find standing water, and some of the older animals weren't managing it. Rhett stood in the doorway of the barn and listened to the report with the face of a man receiving news he'd been bracing for. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing something he couldn't fully manage. We can move the south herd to the east pasture, Dale said. Share the water access from the east branch. It buys us time. How much time? Dale looked at Mara because she was the one with the numbers. If you consolidate the herds on the east branch access, the east branch needs to hold above threshold for, she did the calculation, maybe 6 more days to get us to the injunction hearing and through it. She paused. The east branch is in better shape than the south branch right now. It has a better chance of holding. And if the injunction is denied Wednesday, Rhett said, then we're in a different situation Thursday morning. She didn't sugarcoat it. But the injunction has the certification. Guard thinks it holds. Guard thinks, Rhett said. Not bitterly, just accurately. Yes. She met his eyes. Guard thinks, and I think, and the certification document says what it says. None of us can make the judge rule one way or the other. What I can tell you is that we have built the strongest case the evidence supports. That's what I know how to do, and I've done it. Rhett looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Dale. Move the south herd tonight. I don't want to wait until morning. Dale went to organize it. Rhett stayed in the doorway, looking out at the darkening pasture. The sound of cattle in distress carried from somewhere on the south side. Not loud, just persistent. The particular low sound that meant animals were not right. My grandfather built this place in 30 years from nothing, he said. Not to Mara particularly. Just set it. My father kept it running for another 30. I've had it 12 years. Mara stayed quiet because he wasn't asking for a response. I've always thought the hard part was weather, he said. Drought, bad winters, the things you can't control. He was quiet for a moment. It turns out the harder part is when it's people. Yes, she said. It usually is. He turned from the doorway. The last light was going from the sky, the way it went quickly in dry summers, from burning to dark with almost nothing between. Whatever happens Wednesday, he said, you've done everything that could be done with what you had. It's not enough to be said yet. No. He looked at her. But I wanted to say it now, in case things get complicated and I don't have the chance. He went toward the house, then stopped. The crews are ready. If the injunction doesn't hold and we need to move on the blockage directly, remove it ourselves before they can do anything to complicate access. We can have a crew up there in 8 hours. Mara looked at him. She knew what he was saying. Removing the blockage without legal authorization was not precisely legal. It was interference with a geographical feature that, depending on how a lawyer argued it, could be characterized as private property. It was the kind of action that would complicate every legal proceeding that followed. She also knew that if the cattle were dying and the injunction failed and the threshold activated and ranch families started getting paperwork telling them they had no water rights, the question of what a court would say about it afterward would become secondary to the question of what happened to the valley right now. Let's see what the judge says Wednesday, she said. Rhett nodded. Wednesday, he agreed and went inside. Mara stood in the ranch yard in the cooling dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch being rearranged around the problem that was pressing in on all sides. The distant movement of cattle. Dale's voice giving instructions. Someone with a lamp crossing between the barn and the bunkhouse. 4 days to the creek threshold. 2 days to the injunction hearing. 1 day of margin, maybe, if things held. She had done everything she could do with documents and records and legal filings, and Pruitt's certification, and her own 5 weeks of building evidence in a dusty basement, while Gerald Hess resented her existence. She had done it as carefully as she knew how, and now she was standing in a ranch yard on a hot night listening to sick cattle and watching the numbers close in. And the next move was not hers. She had never been good at that part. The waiting. She pulled out her notebook and checked the creek level she'd recorded that morning, and then she did the arithmetic one more time, even though she knew what the answer was going to be, because doing it again was at least something to do with her hands while the night settled in around Blackstone Ridge. And the drought kept doing what droughts do. The injunction hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning on Wednesday, in the territorial court 2 towns over. A deliberate choice by Guard, who'd filed in the territorial jurisdiction rather than the county jurisdiction specifically to get out from under the local judicial relationships that Harlan Voss had spent 12 years cultivating on the land board. The territorial judge was a woman named Heloise Crane, 60 years old, appointed from the capital, who had a reputation for reading everything put in front of her and ruling on what it actually said rather than what the parties wanted it to say. Guard had appeared before her twice. He trusted her process, if not her outcome. Mara was in the courtroom when it opened, sitting beside Guard at the petitioner's table with the full documentation organized in the sequence they had agreed upon the night before. Rhett was in the gallery with Dale and Frank Drummond, who had insisted on coming and whom no one had been able to talk out of it. Ruth Henderson was there too, which surprised Mara until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. Dexter Rowan sat at the respondents' table alone. Harlan Voss was not present, which Mara had expected. Voss was too careful to be visibly present at a proceeding that might go badly. Warren Voss was certainly not there. The Voss family operated on the principle of distance from consequences, which was part of why they'd built the structure the way they had. Judge Crane came in, settled herself, looked at the papers already on her bench, and said, "Mr. Guard, petitioner's basis for emergency injunction." Guard stood. He had the quality in court of someone who had decided exactly how much space he was going to occupy and occupied it without apology. He laid out the case in the order they'd built it: the water rights restructuring, the conditionality mechanism, the connection to the Voss family's acquisition strategy, and then, last and most carefully, Pruitt's certification of the mountain blockage. When he placed the certification document on the judge's bench, he said, "This certifies deliberate obstruction of a territorial water channel constructed approximately 60 years ago, sufficient to reduce East Branch flow below the shortage threshold defined in the contested water rights structure." The petitioner asserts that the shortage conditions being used to justify the conditionality activation are not naturally occurring, but are partially the result of this deliberate obstruction. Under Territorial Water Law Section 7, artificially maintained shortage cannot form the legal basis for conditionality activation. Judge Crane read the certification without speaking. She read it the way Mara read things she was taking seriously, not quickly. Rouhani's response was measured and organized. He challenged the certification's authority, questioned Pruitt's methodology, argued that the blockage was a natural geological formation that Pruitt had misclassified, and maintained that the water rights structure was lawfully filed and administratively approved. He was good. Mara had expected him to be good. He hit every point where their case had a gap, and he hit them without overselling, which was the sign of a lawyer who understood that overselling a weak argument makes it weaker. But he couldn't undo the certification. He could challenge it, raise questions about it, invite the judge to discount it. He couldn't make it not exist. Judge Crane asked Guard 2 questions. She asked Rowan 4. Then she looked at both tables and said she would rule before noon. They waited in the corridor. Rhett stood with his arms crossed and his back against the wall, not talking. Frank Drummond talked enough for everyone, mostly about water and weather and things that had happened on his property 30 years ago, which was his way of being present without asking questions he knew no one could answer. Ruth Henderson had brought a tin of something she called traveling food and offered it to everyone, which Mara accepted because she'd barely eaten that morning and her stomach was reminding her of this. At 11:42, Judge Crane ruled. She granted the injunction, not entirely as filed. She narrowed the scope to a 30-day hold on any conditionality activation rather than the indefinite suspension Guard had requested, and she required a follow-up hearing within that window where the physical evidence would be examined more extensively. But the hold was real and immediate. The conditionality threshold could not be legally triggered for 30 days, and any legal actions taken under it during that period were void. Guard came out of the courtroom and found Mara in the corridor and said, 30 days. She let out a breath that she'd been holding, she realized, since sometime the previous day. That's enough. It's enough for the next step. It's not the end of the case. I know. She looked at Rhett, who'd read the result in Guard's face before anyone spoke. 30 days. Rhett nodded slowly. The tension in his jaw didn't fully release. He understood, as Mara did, that 30 days was a window and not a conclusion, but something shifted in his posture. The immediate cliff edge had moved back. Frank Drummond said, "Does this mean they can't take the water?" "Not for 30 days, Guard said. "After that, it depends on what we can establish in the follow-up hearing." Frank thought about that. 30 days is a start, he said, with the pragmatism of a man who had been farming long enough to know that you took what the season gave you. They were 2 hours outside Blackstone Ridge on the ride back when Dale Oakes met them on the road. He'd ridden out to find them, which was unusual enough that Mara felt it before he said a word. Something in the set of his shoulders, the pace he'd been riding. "What happened?" Rhett said. "Not a question. Someone was on the mountain last night," Dale said. "Cutter stayed at the site after you all came down for the hearing. He said 2 men came up from the north approach about 2 hours before dawn. He watched them from the cover above. They were at the blockage for about an hour." The road was quiet. Heat moved in the dry grass on both sides. "What did they do to it?" Mara asked. Cutter couldn't tell exactly from his position. They were working at the base. He thought they might be trying to make it look more like a natural rockfall, rearranging the surface material. Dale looked at Rhett. "He drove them off at first light, fired over their heads. They left." "Did he recognize them?" "He said one of them was a man named Peel. Works for Voss's freight operation." Rhett was quiet for a moment. How bad is the damage to the site? Cutter said they didn't get far. Maybe an hour of work before he moved them. The primary structure is still intact, but the surface arrangement is different than what was documented. Mara's mind went immediately to the photographs, to Pruitt's certification, to the comparison between what was documented and what the site looked like now. The certification was already filed and already in the record. They couldn't undo that. But if the site had been altered enough to create visual ambiguity between the documented state and the current state, Rowan could use that ambiguity in the follow-up hearing to argue that Pruitt had certified a natural formation that was subsequently misidentified. "I need to get back up there," she said. "With Pruitt, if he'll come. We need documentation of what was changed in comparison photographs." "Pruitt is still in the territory," Guard said. He'd been riding quietly beside her, processing the same information. "I'll send word tonight." "And Cutter needs to make a formal statement," Mara said. "What he saw, when, the men's behavior, everything, in writing, witnessed." "I'll sit with him tonight," Dale said. Rhett looked at the road ahead, then at Mara. "This is going to keep going. Every time we establish something, they'll move against it." "Yes," she said. "That's what people do when they're protecting something they built for 20 years. She looked at him steadily. "But every time they move against what we've built, they leave a record. The complaint filing, the hearing. Now 2 men on the mountain at 2 in the morning trying to alter a certified site. Every one of those is evidence of consciousness of guilt, and I am documenting every one of them." He held her eyes for a moment. "Okay, it's not over," she said. "I'm not saying it's over. I'm saying we have 30 days and we know what we need to do with them." The 30 days were the hardest stretch of work Mara had ever done, and she had done genuinely hard work in her life, so that was a meaningful statement. She and Pruitt went back up the mountain 4 days after the hearing. The site had been disturbed. Cutter's assessment was accurate, but less than Roan would have needed to create real ambiguity. Someone had rearranged the surface stones at the base of the blockage in a way that softened the most clearly constructed-looking elements. But the underlying structure was intact, and Pruitt was able to document the changes in a supplementary certification that, if anything, strengthened the overall case. A site that has been visibly interfered with after being legally challenged is a site that someone was motivated to alter, and motivation implies knowledge. "They helped us," Pruitt said, standing at the base of the blockage with his measuring equipment and his unhurried professional calm. "Whoever sent those men up here, they helped us." "They panicked," Mara said. "Same thing sometimes." She documented everything: the original photographs, the certification, the supplementary certification, Cutter's written statement, the tracks Cutter had photographed in the dawn light before they were too degraded to read clearly. She built a chronological record of the interference attempt that Guard said was the most useful thing to come out of an otherwise alarming situation. Meanwhile, Guard had contacted the Territorial Water Authority, which was a different body from the County Land Board and operated under territorial rather than county jurisdiction. The Water Authority had the power to investigate interference with territorial water systems, exactly the kind of authority that applied to a deliberately constructed blockage in a territorial channel. The certification triggered a formal investigation, which meant the Territorial Water Authority now had independent standing to examine the blockage site. It also meant that what had been Mara Quinn's investigation of county records had become a territorial matter, handled by people with the authority to compel documents and testimony that she'd never been able to compel. The territorial investigator who came to Blackstone Ridge was a man named Arthur Steen, who was unremarkable in appearance and extraordinarily thorough in practice. He interviewed Mara for 4 hours the first day and 3 hours the second, not because he doubted what she told him, but because he needed to understand every link in the chain well enough to defend it against challenge. He interviewed Rhett. He interviewed Guard. He requested documents from the county records office, a formal request that Gerald Hess could not decline the way he'd been declining Mara's informal ones. And he spent 2 days in the basement archive that had given Mara such trouble. He also interviewed Harlan Voss, which happened at the county courthouse in a closed session that Mara was not present for, but which Dale reported on in some detail based on what he'd been able to gather from people who'd seen Voss arrive and leave. Voss had arrived composed and left composed, which told you nothing about what had happened in between, but which told you something about the quality of person you were dealing with. "He's not going to crack in an interview," Mara told Guard. "He's been building this for 20 years. He's thought about what he'd say in exactly this kind of room. That's why we don't need him to crack, Guard said. We need the documents to say what they say. People can lie in interviews. Documents are harder to argue with. The documents were saying quite a lot. Staten's access to county records that had previously been off limits was producing connections that Mara had suspected but hadn't been able to establish directly. A correspondence file she'd never had access to contained internal land board communications that tracked the water rights refiling process in a way that made the coordination between the administrative approvals and the acquisition strategy unmistakable. It was not the smoking gun of explicit instruction. Harlan Voss was too careful for that. But it was systematic documentation of a man who always seemed to be in the right position at the right time to approve the right things. And the pattern, accumulated over 12 years, was the kind that made coincidence an increasingly implausible explanation. Stane came to Mara after his second day in the archive and said, "You had all of this mapped out correctly." She was sitting at Gideon Pratt's table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "I had the parts I could access," she said. "You found the parts I couldn't. The methodology was correct. The conclusions were correct." He looked at her with a directness that was not quite admiration, but was in that neighborhood. "You did this from the outside, without subpoena power, without formal authority, without any of the tools I have access to. How long have you been at this?" "About 7 weeks." He considered that. "The territorial authority is going to have questions about how this was conducted. I want you to know that my report will characterize the originating investigation as competent and properly bounded." She held his eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm just characterizing it accurately." He stood. "We'll need your full documentation transferred to the authority's case file. Everything. The survey maps, the filings comparison, the creek level data, the photographs, Pruitt's certification, Cutter's statement, all of it. It's organized and ready." She'd kept it that way from the beginning, against exactly this possibility. "You can have it tomorrow." The follow-up hearing happened on the 21st day of the injunction window. By that point, the case had grown beyond what any single hearing could resolve him. The Territorial Water Authority investigation had its own momentum, its own timeline, its own legal instruments. What the hearing established was whether the injunction would be extended while those instruments did their work. Judge Crane extended it indefinitely, pending the Territorial Authority's findings. Dexter Rowan requested a stay of the extension. Judge Crane denied it. She did it in 2 sentences, without elaboration, in the way of someone who has read everything and found one side's argument materially stronger than the other's. Outside the courthouse afterward, Mara stood in the sun with Guard and Rhett and a collection of ranch families who'd come for the hearing because word had gotten out what it meant, and she tried to feel the shape of where things were. The injunction was extended. The investigation was running. The evidence was in professional hands with the authority to do something with it. The immediate crisis, the threat of conditionality activation, the immediate risk to the valley's water access, had been held off long enough for the larger process to engage. It was not over. Voss and his brother had resources and lawyers and the kind of tenacity that comes from having a great deal to lose. The case would go on for months, possibly longer. There would be more filings, more hearings, more pressure applied to the families in the valley who were already tired from the drought and from the uncertainty of the past weeks. But the structure that had been built in the dark over 20 years was visible now. It was in court documents and territorial authority files and the written records of multiple proceedings. It could not be made invisible again. Ruth Henderson found her in the small crowd outside the courthouse and stood next to her for a moment without saying anything, in the way of someone who is simply choosing to be in the same space. "The creek's coming up," Ruth said finally. Mara looked at her. "What?" "East Branch. Frank Drummond checked it this morning before he rode over here. It's up about 4 inches from last week." Mara thought about that. The injunction had held the legal threat, but the creek rising? That was the drought breaking, or the upstream conditions changing, or both. "How much rain did you get up north?" "Some. Not enough for 4 inches in a week." Ruth looked at her. "Frank thinks something changed up in the mountain terrain." Mara went still. The 2 men on the mountain. Cutter driving them off. The blockage that Pruitt had certified as intact in the supplementary report. But Pruitt's supplementary certification had been about the primary blockage structure, the main construction. It hadn't specifically examined the drainage points at the base, where someone working for an hour in the dark might not have been rearranging the surface material for camouflage purposes, but interfering with something else entirely. She found Rhett in the crowd. "The creek is up," she said. He looked at her. He'd heard what she'd said to Ruth. Upstream change. "I need to go back up there. I need to see what those men actually did to the blockage." He was already looking for Dale. They went up the next day, the three of them plus Cutter, who knew the approach. Pruitt came too. Guard had insisted, and he was right to. Whatever they found needed to be documented by someone with professional standing. What they found was not what any of them had expected. The two men who'd come in the dark had not been trying to camouflage the blockage. They'd been trying to reinforce it, and they'd done it incompetently, working in the dark, in a hurry, without the knowledge that whoever had built it originally had possessed. What they'd actually done was disturb the seal at the lower drainage point of the blockage, the section where the original construction had been most carefully engineered. They'd created a fracture in the structure that was allowing water to seep through in small quantities that, over the days since they'd been there, had been working at the point of fracture the way water works at any weakness, patiently, persistently, without effort. Pruitt examined the fracture for a long time without speaking. Mara stood back and let him work. Rhett stood beside her and watched the water moving, thin but moving, through the base of the structure and down the dry channel below. "The fracture is going to expand," Pruitt said finally. "The water pressure above the blockage is significant. Now that it has an outlet, however small, it's going to work at this point until the seal fails." He looked at the structure. "Weeks, probably. Maybe less, depending on the upstream pressure." "Can it be helped along?" Rhett asked. He said it carefully, like a man testing the ground before he puts weight on it. Pruitt looked at him. "You mean, could the structure be deliberately removed?" "I mean, can it be removed legally, now that the Territorial Authority investigation is running and the site has been certified?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "That's a legal question, not a surveying question." "I know, I'm asking your opinion." "My opinion is that the Territorial Water Authority has the power to order restoration of an illegally obstructed water channel. My opinion is that the documentation we've submitted gives them clear grounds to exercise that power." He looked at the fracture, at the thin thread of water moving through it. "My opinion is that if they were inclined to move quickly, they could have an authorization in place within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Mara looked at the water finding its way through the crack. "Guard needs to make that request today," she said. "I'll call it in when we get back within telegraph range," Guard said from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. They stood at the base of the blockage, the thing built in the dark 60 years ago by people who trusted that no one would ever look closely enough, and watched the water moving through the place where two frightened men in the dark had inadvertently done what 5 weeks of records work had been building toward. It was not the ending, but it was the beginning of the ending, and Mara knew the difference. The Territorial Authority's removal authorization came in 11 days. Guard had pushed hard for it, and the investigation's findings, now extensive enough to constitute a formal preliminary report, had given the authority grounds to act. The order authorized removal of the obstructing structure from the territorial water channel as a restoration action under Section 12 of the Territorial Water Management Statute. Rhett assembled the crew he'd said he could have ready in 8 hours. He'd been keeping them mentally assembled for weeks, so it actually took less than that. 7 men, the right equipment, pry bars, sledgehammers, the careful muscle of people who'd been moving rock their whole lives, and a 2-day ride up into the mountain terrain that by now Mara could navigate without referring to the map. She went with them. Of course she went with them. The work took most of the day. The blockage, once its integrity had been compromised by the fracture, came apart with less resistance than Mara had expected, though hard physical work was never truly easy, and the crew was exhausted by afternoon and working through it. The primary stones came out in stages, and with each stage the water pressure above increased, and the flow through the base became stronger. And then, in the mid-afternoon, the last of the primary structure gave way. The channel filled. Not instantly. The word she'd been waiting to think and hadn't let herself was surge, and it was a surge, but it was also gradual in the way of water finding its level, a progressive deepening in the carved rock of the old channel as the backed-up volume above found the outlet it had been denied for 60 years. Within an hour, the channel was running with clear, cold mountain water, at a rate that made the creek levels she'd been monitoring for 7 weeks look like a memory of a different place. She stood at the edge of the channel with her boots getting wet and watched it. And she didn't say anything, and neither did Rhett, who was standing about 6 feet away with the same silence. One of the crew, a young man named Percy, who was 20 at most and had been working hard all day with the uncomplaining energy of someone still figuring out what his body could do, whooped once, loudly, and then looked embarrassed about it. Frank Drummond, who had somehow also ended up on this mountain despite being 71 and nobody's specific responsibility, laughed at the whoop with a fullness that had nothing embarrassed about it at all. Dale Oak said, "That's going to change the numbers." "Yes," Mara said, "it is." She pulled out her notebook, took the time measurement, estimated the flow rate as best she could, which was not precise but was good enough. Did the arithmetic on what this volume, added to the East Branch baseline, would do to the shortage threshold calculations. The threshold wouldn't activate. Couldn't with this volume in the system. The conditionality structure that Harlan Voss had spent 20 years building toward was premised on a drought-induced shortage that had itself been premised on a water system that had been artificially restricted. With the restriction removed, the premise failed. She wrote it down. She wrote everything down, always, because this was going in the record along with everything else. Rhett came over and looked at what she was writing. He read it without asking, because by this point they'd spent enough time working together that the formalities of permission had mostly dissolved into a simpler arrangement. "So it's done," he said. "The physical part is done," she said. "The legal part runs for a while yet. The investigation, the hearings, whatever Voss and his brother and Rowan put together as a response." She looked at the running water. "But the leverage is gone. Everything they built was built on controlling access to this water. They don't control it anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you know that this is what we'd find up here?" She thought about it honestly. "When I read my father's note, why does the creek run lower now?" He asked that question because the math didn't add up. The rainfall patterns didn't explain the flow reduction. Something was taking water out of the system that shouldn't be taking water out. She paused. "I didn't know it was a physical blockage. I thought it might be upstream diversion or unauthorized extraction or any number of things. But I knew the water was going somewhere it shouldn't have been going, and that somewhere was on this mountain." "Your father would have found this." "Maybe. He didn't have 5 weeks to spend in the county records." She closed the notebook. "He had a farm to run." The crew was starting to pack up the equipment. The light was going in the way it went at altitude. Quickly, the shadows deepening in the channel. The water kept moving, indifferent to the exhaustion of everyone standing around it, doing what water does when you give it somewhere to go. "The follow-up hearings," Rhett said. "You'll need to be there." "I'll be there. And Staten will want more from you. The investigation isn't finished." "I know. And the ranch families are going to have questions about what happens next with the land board, with their water rights filings, with whether the Voss acquisitions get reversed." "I know, Rhett." He looked at her. "I'm not asking whether you can handle it. I'm asking what you need to handle it." She considered that. It was a different question from most people's versions of the same concern. "I need Gideon Pratt to keep letting me use his table. I need the records office to stay open. I need—" She stopped. "I need someone to explain to Gerald Hess that he's going to cooperate with the territorial investigation without his usual approach, because I don't have the patience for it anymore." "I'll talk to Gerald Hess," Rhett said. "You don't have to." "I'll talk to Gerald Hess," he said again, plainly. "Let me do that part." She looked at him for a moment, at the steady, uncomplicated way he was offering it. Not rescue, not charity, just a man dividing up the work according to who was positioned to do which piece of it most effectively. "Fine," she said. "Thank you." Percy whooped again in the distance, apparently having decided that if he was going to be embarrassed about it once, he might as well commit. Someone threw something at him, gently, and there was laughter, and the crew came together in the loose, easy way of people who have done a hard day's work and know it. The water ran down the mountain toward the valley below, picking up speed as it found its old course, a course it had been cut off from for longer than anyone currently standing on that mountain had been alive. In Blackstone Ridge, the East Branch would be rising by morning. Mara Quinn stood at the edge of the channel and felt the cold spray on her face and thought about her father and about water and about the extraordinary stubbornness required to keep asking why when everyone around you has already decided there's no point. She didn't feel triumphant exactly. She felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been running towards something for a long time and has finally reached it and can feel the full weight of the running all at once, now that it's no longer what's keeping her upright. There was still work to do, a great deal of it. But the water was moving. The East Branch was up 8 inches by the following morning. Frank Drummond measured it himself at first light, standing in the creek in his boots without apparently caring about the boots, and sent word to everyone he knew by way of his grandson riding the South Road at a pace that suggested the boy understood the importance of what he was carrying. By mid-morning, half the valley knew. By afternoon, the other half knew. And people were coming out to the creek banks the way people come out after long illness to stand in fresh air. Not celebrating exactly, just needing to confirm with their own senses that the thing was real. Mara heard about it at Gideon Pratt's table, where she'd spent the morning transferring the last of her documentation to the format Arthur Stain had requested for the Territorial Authority's case file. Gideon told her, and she wrote down the measurement in her notebook, 8 inches above yesterday's reading, and sat with it for a moment before going back to what she'd been doing. She was not, she realized, as surprised as she would have expected to be. She'd run the numbers enough times that the result felt more like confirmation than revelation. The surprise had been used up somewhere in the previous 7 weeks, distributed across all the moments when things had worked out differently than she'd feared. What was left now was something quieter. The particular stillness of a person who has been moving hard towards something and has arrived at it and is still catching their breath. The legal machinery, she knew, was far from quiet. Stain's preliminary report had gone to the Territorial Authority 10 days after the blockage removal, and its findings were not modest. The report documented the deliberate construction of the blockage, the water rights restructuring over 22 years, the connection between the restructuring and the Voss family's acquisition strategy, and the interference attempt at the certified site. The two men in the dark who had, in trying to protect the scheme, handed Staten's investigation one of its cleanest pieces of evidence. The men were identified. Peel, as Cutter had said, and a second man named Garvey, both employees of Voss's freight operation. Both were interviewed by Staten under formal authority. Both declined to answer certain questions, which was their right, and also, as Guard observed, a choice that carried its own implications. Harlan Voss's attorney, Dexter Rohn, filed a comprehensive response challenging every element of the preliminary report. It was meticulous work. Rohn was not going to let his client go without a thorough fight, and it identified genuine areas of evidentiary ambiguity that Staten's team had to address in supplementary filings. The case did not resolve cleanly or quickly. These things never do. What it did was move, steadily and with the weight of accumulated documentation behind it, in a direction that Rohan's filings could slow but not reverse. The land board proceedings were a separate thread. Harlan Voss's position on the board became untenable within 3 weeks of the Territorial Authority's investigation becoming public record. He did not resign immediately. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures, but he stopped attending sessions, and the board chair, the harried Foster who had presided over the administrative complaint hearing, convened a special session to address the conflict of interest question that Guard had been raising since the beginning. Voss's resignation from the board was submitted quietly, through his attorney, on a Tuesday morning that Mara spent at Gideon Pratt's table going through water rights filings she was helping Staten's team organize. She heard about it from Guard, who told her by letter rather than in person, because he was back in the Capitol working the territorial court filings. The resignation is effective immediately. It changes nothing about the investigation's scope or timeline, but it closes one avenue of procedural interference that Rohan had been positioning to use. I thought you'd want to know, child. She read the letter once, then folded it and put it with the others she'd kept. Not many, but the ones that marked specific turns in the sequence of events. She didn't feel satisfaction about Voss's resignation the way she might have expected to. What she felt was more like the recognition of a fact. One piece of the structure had come down. Others were still standing. The work continued. Warren Voss was a harder target. He was in the Capitol. He was insulated by the holding company layers between himself and the visible transactions, and his attorney was a different firm than Rowan's, one with deep territorial court experience. The Meridian Land and Resources connection. The thread that ran from Martin Felton's card in Frank Drummond's pocket through Crestfield Development to Warren Voss was documented in Steen's report, but establishing legal liability required a standard of evidence that took months to build. Mara knew this. She'd told Rhett early on that the capital end of the scheme was the harder target. She hadn't been wrong about that. What happened with Warren Voss happened slowly and then all at once, the way financial and legal reckoning tends to happen when the structure underneath finally gives. The turning point was a records request Staten filed in the Capitol that produced internal Crestfield development correspondence from 8 years prior, the period when the land acquisition strategy had accelerated. The correspondence was between Warren Voss and a financial partner named Clement Hayes, and it contained, in the careful language of men who thought they were writing privately, a discussion of the drought scenario that was explicit enough about the water rights mechanism that Rowaney's counterpart in the Capitol apparently advised Warren Voss to consider a settlement rather than take the correspondence into an open court proceeding. Guard called Mara the day he received the news. He didn't announce it with ceremony. He just said, "Warren Voss's people reached out. They want to talk about settlement terms." She was in her room above the dry goods store, sitting on the edge of the cot with the window open to the September air, which had finally begun to carry something other than heat. What kind of settlement? Full financial restitution to every property whose value was affected by the artificially maintained water shortage. Dissolution of Meridian land and resources. Divestment of all land holdings acquired through the Crestfield structure. A formal admission, in the settlement agreement, of the water rights manipulation. She was quiet for a moment. The admission matters. I told them it was non-negotiable. And Harlan? Separate proceedings. Harlan is the county piece, the land board conduct, the administrative approvals. That's still going through the territorial court, but Warren's settling removes the capital level protection that Harlan's defense has been relying on. A pause. It accelerates things on Harlan's end considerably. She thought about those board members who had sat in that courthouse room and approved 3 rounds of water rights refilings over 12 years. She thought about Caldwell Briggs, Harlan's attorney, who had submitted those filings. She thought about the water that had been held in a mountain for 60 years, while the valley below it grew slowly drier and the people in it attributed the change to weather and luck and the natural variance of things. How long for the formal settlement? Weeks for negotiation, another month for execution, if it holds. It'll hold, she said. The correspondence is what it is. Guard didn't argue with her. He'd read the correspondence. She was right. Harlan Voss's reckoning arrived in November, on a day that smelled like the first real threat of winter, the kind of cold that means business. The territorial court found sufficient cause for formal proceedings on the land board conduct charges: abuse of administrative authority, conspiracy to defraud property rights holders, and accessory liability for the fraudulent water rights restructuring. The criminal proceedings were separate from the civil case and moved on their own timeline. But the civil judgment, which came 6 weeks later, was substantial enough that it made the Capitol newspapers and caused a particular stir in Blackstone Ridge, where people had known Harlan Voss as a civic institution for 12 years. He did not ultimately go to prison. The criminal proceedings took a route that Guard described as legally complicated in ways that frustrated everyone who had been watching, and the final resolution was a suspended sentence, significant financial penalties, and a permanent prohibition from holding any public office or serving on any governmental board in the territory. It was not the outcome Mara had hoped for, and not the outcome the evidence arguably warranted, and she sat with her anger about it for a couple of days before she allowed herself to set it aside and look at what had actually been accomplished. The civil judgment was real. The financial restitution was real. The water rights restructuring was unwound. Every fraudulent refiling voided, the original equitable structure restored, every ranch family in the valley put back in the legal position they should have been in for 20 years. The land acquisitions made through the Crestfield structure were reversed through the settlement terms. Properties returned to the families who had sold under circumstances that the settlement agreement acknowledged as economically coerced. The Drummond operation stayed with Frank Drummond, which he took with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had refused a buyer on instinct and turned out to be right. And the East Branch ran. Through September and October and the gray edges of November, it ran at a volume no one in the current generation of valley residents had seen from it. The mountain water that had been held back for 60 years finally finding its course and holding it. Clara Weston came to see Mara on a Thursday afternoon in late October, which was not something Mara had expected and was, initially, not something she wanted to deal with. She was at Gideon Pratt's office, still, always, because Gideon's table had become her unofficial headquarters, and Gideon had shown no sign of minding. When Clara appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of someone who has decided to do something they're not sure they can actually do. Clara was dressed well, as she always was, and she looked genuinely uncomfortable in a way that Mara, who had spent a great deal of her life being dismissed by people like Clara Weston, recognized as costing something real. "Do you have a minute?" Clara said. Not quite a question. Mara put down her pen. "Yes." Clara came in and sat across from her without being invited, which was Clara's way in every room, and then sat there for a moment, as if whatever she'd planned to say had partially departed. "I wanted to say that I was wrong," she said finally. "About what I said. About you and all of it. The things I said when people started talking about you going to the records office. The things I said about why you were spending time with Rhett Calloway." Mara looked at her. "I was unkind," Clara said. "I was unkind and I was wrong, and I think I've been both of those things for a long time when it came to you, and I'm—" She stopped. "I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Through the window, the main street of Blackstone Ridge was doing its mid-afternoon business, people moving, horses at the hitching posts, the ordinary texture of a place that had not changed much on the surface despite everything that had shifted underneath it. Mara thought about what she wanted to say. She thought about how she'd felt in rooms where Clara Weston's assessment had been the ambient climate, the low-grade damage of being seen as less, not because of anything you'd done, but because of the shape you occupied and the circumstances you'd been born into. She thought about how that kind of thing accumulates without ever quite being addressable, because it's delivered in looks and silences, and the particular tone of certain conversations rather than in anything you could point to directly. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who performed forgiveness, she didn't mean, "It helps." Clara held her eyes for a moment and then nodded, and something in her posture loosened a little. She didn't try to extend the conversation into something warmer than it was, which Mara respected. She left without saying much more, and Mara watched her go and felt the complicated texture of a moment that was neither triumphant nor painful, but simply real, the way most meaningful things are when they arrive. Rhett came to find her on a Friday evening in November, after the first proper frost had laid itself over the valley like a claim. She was at her room, which she'd been packing, not because she'd been asked to leave, but because the conversation she'd been putting off having with herself had finally happened, and she'd acknowledged that the room above the dry goods store was a temporary arrangement that she'd been making permanent by inertia. He knocked, which he hadn't strictly needed to since the door was open, and leaned in the frame. "You're packing." Observant. "Where are you going?" She looked at the trunk, which was not large and which contained everything she owned, and which had been sitting in this same corner for 2 years. "I've been offered a position," she said. "The Territorial Water Authority has opened a formal division for water rights documentation and compliance oversight. Staten is heading it. He asked if I wanted to come work for it." Rhett was quiet. "In the capital," she said. "It's in the capital." "I know where the Territorial Water Authority is." She looked at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his expression doing the thing it did when he was thinking about something he wasn't ready to say yet. "It's the right work," she said. "What we did here, the records review, the pattern identification, the documentation methodology, that's what the division is going to do, systematically, for the whole territory. Finding the places where water rights have been manipulated, protecting property holders who don't have the resources to do it themselves." She paused. "It's the work. It's just a larger version of it." "I know," he said. "You should take it." She looked at him. "You're not going to argue about it." "Why would I argue about it?" "I don't know. I thought maybe—" She stopped herself. What had she thought? She wasn't certain. She'd been circling this conversation in her head for 2 weeks, building arguments for the position she'd already decided on, building counter-arguments she'd never fully credited. Never mind. Rhett came the rest of the way into the room, which given its dimensions meant he was now standing about 4 feet from her. "The ranch has a position too," he said, "in case you were wondering." She looked at him carefully. What kind of position? The kind where someone who is very good at reading water rights documentation and identifying patterns that other people miss helps ensure that Broken Creek Ranch doesn't get into this situation again, among other things. He held her eyes. The kind that pays fairly, has a decent room that isn't this one, and doesn't require you to go to the Capitol. Mara looked at the trunk, at the wall, at Rhett Calloway standing in her room in November, saying something that she could interpret several ways and was choosing for the moment to interpret as straightforwardly as it had been offered. That's a real offer. I don't make unreal ones. I know. She was quiet for a moment. The Capitol position is the work I want to do. I know that too. But I'm not sure I want to go immediately. There are things still running here. The civil judgment implementation, the water rights restoration filings for the families. She looked at him. Staten said the position doesn't need to start until spring. Spring, Rhett said. That gives several months. Several months, he said again, in the tone of a man confirming an arrangement he finds acceptable. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything else about it, which was its own kind of statement. They had never been people who said things before they were ready to say them. It was, she thought, one of the reasons they'd been able to work together as well as they had, the shared understanding that not everything needed to be named immediately, that sometimes you could let the shape of something develop without forcing it into words before you knew what the words were. The families are having a gathering Saturday, he said, changing the subject with the efficiency of a man who is done with the part of the conversation he came for. At the Hendersons. Ruth's organizing it. She asked if you'd come. What kind of gathering? The kind where people eat and talk and try to process that the thing they were afraid of didn't happen. He paused. You should come. I don't really, she started. Mara. She looked at him. You saved their ranches, he said. Not with drama, just as information. Let them say thank you. The gathering at Ruth Henderson's was noisy and warm and crowded in a way that Mara found initially overwhelming and then, slowly, something else. 12 families, the ones from the barn meeting and more besides, people who'd heard afterward and understood afterward what had been at stake, children underfoot. The smell of something Ruth had been cooking since morning. Frank Drummond in the corner telling the same story about the business card he'd told 4 times already, with the particular pleasure of a man whose instinct had been vindicated and who saw no reason not to enjoy it. People came to her throughout the evening. Not all of them made speeches. Most of them didn't, because these were not people given to speeches. They said things like, we didn't understand what you were doing at first, and I heard what Carl Briggs said at the meeting, and I want you to know, I thought he was wrong. And from Agnes Kearney, the woman who had said that Harlan Voss had done a lot for this community. I owe you an apology. I knew something was wrong, and I didn't look at it because looking at it was frightening. You looked at it anyway. Mara said the things you say, and meant them with varying degrees of completeness, and tried to receive what people were offering without deflecting all of it, because deflecting all of it would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Ruth Henderson found her near the end of the evening, when the gathering had thinned to the families who were still eating and the ones who'd always been the last to leave anything. You're going to the Capitol, Ruth said. She'd heard, the way things got heard. In the spring. Ruth nodded slowly. Good work shouldn't stay in one county. She looked at Mara. Will you come back? I'll come back, Mara said. She meant it. This valley was in her. Her father's notes, the creek levels she'd watched for 7 weeks, the mountain terrain she knew now in her body the way you know places you've worked hard in. This is where I learned what I know how to do. Ruth handed her a jar of something she'd put up from her kitchen garden. For the road, she said simply, and went to attend to her other guests. Mara thought, driving home that night in the cold with the jar on the seat beside her, about what it meant to have been the person she'd been through all of this. Not the version that would be told later. Already she could hear the edges of a story forming around the summer's events. A cleaner story with a cleaner arc than the actual thing had been. The version that would be told would not include Gerald Hess's coffee cup laugh, or the way her boot heel had rubbed for 2 days on a mountain she'd pretended not to be suffering on, or the 3 nights she'd lain awake running the arithmetic again because she couldn't trust herself not to have made an error somewhere. The version that would be told would not include the meeting where Carl Briggs's patience had felt like a physical thing pressing on her chest, or the morning the county notice arrived and she'd stood in the ranch yard and felt, briefly and completely, the specific despair of someone who is trying to do something necessary and finding the machinery of the world arranged against it. The actual thing had been harder and less heroic and more sustained than stories tend to manage. It had been built out of the ordinary materials of sustained attention, reading the same documents again, measuring the creek at the same time 3 days a week, writing down everything because the record mattered more than the memory. There was no single moment of triumph. There was just the accumulation of right work done consistently, and the refusal to stop doing it when stopping would have been much easier. She thought about her father, as she often did. She thought about what he'd understood and what he hadn't been able to get to, and about the note in the margin that had started all of it. Why does the creek run lower now? He'd asked the right question. He just hadn't had the circumstances to follow it. The farm had needed running, and then the farm had gone, and then he'd gone, and the question had waited in the margin of an old pamphlet for his daughter to find it. There is something that gets called instinct in people who are good at a particular kind of seeing, but Mara had come to think it wasn't instinct at all. It was just the combination of attention and stubbornness, the willingness to keep looking at something until it told you what it was, even when every person around you was telling you you were looking at nothing. Her father had that. She'd inherited it the way you inherit certain ways of being in the world, not from instruction, but from proximity, from watching someone practice it over a long period until the practice became invisible and just looked like character. She did not think the valley owed her anything. She did not think she had done something remarkable. She had done what seemed necessary, with the tools she had, because someone needed to do it, and she was the person who had looked closely enough to see why. That was the simplest version of it, the most accurate version. She had been the person in the room who was paying attention when something important was happening, and she had not stopped paying attention when it would have been convenient to stop. The territory would be different for it, not transformed. The territory was a big place, full of its own history and its own ongoing arrangements, and what happened in Blackstone Ridge was not the end of any system. There were other valleys and other water rights and other men who built structures in the dark and trusted that the darkness would hold. The division Staten was building was not going to resolve all of that. It was going to address some of it consistently, in the way that consistent work addresses things, not by eliminating the problem, but by reducing the damage it can do. That was enough to go to work for. It was not a grand vision. It was just enough. Popsy. The last thing Mara did before she drove out of Blackstone Ridge on the first day of spring was go down to the East Branch and check the creek level. She'd brought the notebook, obviously. The same one she'd started in August, the pages thick now, with measurement after measurement. The record of a system going from crisis to threshold to restoration over the better part of a year. She wrote down the number and then looked at it for a moment. The creek was high, not flood high. Just the steady, generous running of a water system that had what it needed and was working the way it was supposed to. The sound of it was different from the sound she'd first learned to listen to when she'd started checking it. Fuller. Less effortful. She looked at the water for a while. She thought about what she'd tell people, eventually, if they asked her how she'd managed it. She already knew that whatever she told them wouldn't quite be right, because the true answer wasn't the kind that resolved into a satisfying statement. The true answer was something like, I believed the records over the people who told me the records were wrong. I kept measuring when measuring felt pointless. I asked for help when I needed it. I accepted help in the places where my pride was getting in the way of what needed to happen. And the part that was hardest to say, because it sounded like it was about her, when it was really about something else entirely. I knew what I was looking for because my father taught me to look. Nothing she'd done was unrepeatable. That was the thing. It wasn't special talent. It wasn't unusual courage. It was just specific, sustained, unglamorous work done by a person who refused to accept that what she saw with her own eyes wasn't real. Anyone could do it. Very few people did, because very few people were willing to keep going when the rooms they walked into were arranged against them. Mara Quinn had walked into those rooms for 23 years. She knew what they felt like. She also knew, now, what it felt like to walk out the other side. She closed the notebook, put it in the trunk with everything else she was carrying, and climbed up onto the wagon seat. The horse, a reliable and unbothered animal who had no opinion about historic investigations, stood ready. Red had come out to see her off. He stood at the edge of the road with his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man who had said what he meant to say already and saw no reason to add to it. They'd had the conversation, the real one, the one that acknowledged what the months had built between them without making promises that depended on geography being simpler than it was. The capital was not close. Spring would become summer. They were both people with a great deal of work to do, and they were both people who understood that work had to come first, or everything built on top of it would be on unstable ground. "Right when you're settled," he said. "I will. And let Stainton know that the East Branch documentation is available if the Territorial Division wants to use the methodology as a baseline for similar investigations." She looked at him. "Even now?" "I'll tell him." "Good." He looked at the horse, the wagon, the road. "The valley looks better," he said, "in case you wanted to know." She looked at the valley too, the morning light coming in long and pale, the grass doing what grass does in spring, the creek sound just audible from the road. "It does," she said. Then she picked up the reins and went. She was not leaving because she was done. She was leaving because there was more to do, in a wider geography, with the tools she'd built here in the doing. That was the nature of this kind of work. It didn't end, it expanded. You learned to do it in one place, and then you took it somewhere larger and you did it again, and then again, not because you believed you would fix everything, but because you understood that the fixing happened incrementally, in the specific places where someone was paying close enough attention to see what was actually wrong. Mara Quinn drove out of Blackstone Ridge on the first morning of spring, with her father's habit of reading and her mother's stubbornness and 7 weeks of creek measurements in a notebook and the full weight of everything she'd learned about what it takes to tell the truth in a room that doesn't want to hear it. She had learned this, that the world does not reward the act of seeing clearly. It rarely thanks you for it, at least not in the moment when the seeing matters most. The reward, if it comes later and sideways and in forms you didn't expect. What the clear seeing itself gives you, the only thing you can count on it giving you, is the ability to act on what is real rather than on what is convenient to believe. That had been enough for her father, who asked his question in the margin of a pamphlet and never got to follow it. It would have to be enough for her, too. It was, she found, looking at the road ahead, enough. The East Branch ran behind her. The mountain water moved through the valley in its old course, the course it had been cut off from before anyone currently alive in Blackstone Ridge had been born. It would keep running now, through dry years and wet years, through whatever came next, because the thing that had been stopping it was gone. Mara Quinn went toward the capital. The water kept moving. That was the end of it, and also the beginning of everything that came after.